This is Audible.
Hancock the Superb, The Life and Career of General Winfield Scott Hancock. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Scott Clem. Introduction. General Hancock is one of the handsomest men in the United States Army. He is tall in stature, robust in figure, with movements of easy dignity. In action, dignity gives way to activity. His features become animated. His voice loud, his eyes are on fire, his blood kindles, and his bearing is that of a man carried away by passion, the character of his bravery. Regis de Trobriand. Despite the fact that the Civil War began over 150 years ago, it remains one of the most widely discussed topics in America today, with Americans arguing over its causes, reenacting its famous battles, and debating which general was better than others. Americans continue to be fascinated by the Civil War icons who made the difference between victory and defeat in the war's great battles. Winfield Scott Hancock was an intimidating figure who impressed friends, foes, and fellow generals alike. Known as Hancock the Superb after McClellan described his performance as such during the Battle of Williamsburg in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, Hancock eventually rose to become the Army of the Potomac's greatest corps commander. Though his reputation and legacy gradually faded over time, Hancock was one of the North's foremost war heroes by the end of the war, and he nearly became president in 1880 when he was just barely defeated by a less decorated Civil War veteran, James Garfield. Nobody in the Army of the Potomac was in the thick of its biggest battles as often as Hancock and the men he commanded. Hancock superbly led his brigade during the Peninsula Campaign, temporarily commanded a division at Antietam in the center of the lines at Sunken Lake, and his division was the last to withdraw across the river during the Battle of Chancellorsville. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, he fortuitously became the new two-corps commander in the Army of the Potomac, just in time to deliver his greatest performance of all. At Gettysburg, Hancock was the commanding general in the field on day one, as Meade and the rest of the Union Army arrived later that night. On day two, Hancock's men assisted Sickles' III Corps when Sickles disobeyed orders and moved it forward, creating a gap in the Union lines. And on day three, Hancock's greatest day of the war, he was seriously injured and nearly bled to death while leading his men in their decisive repulse of Pickett's charge. Hancock's injury was excruciatingly painful, but he was back in command for the 1864 Overland Campaign, where his men played crucial roles in the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, and the Battle of Cold Harbor. By the end of the Civil War, Hancock was one of the highest regarded generals in the North. Like Confederate Corps Commander James Longstreet, Hancock's reputation was attacked after the war because of politics. His Northern brethren were critical of his opposition to the execution of Mary Surratt for the Lincoln assassination. They were enraged when he was leaning on the Southern military district he governed during Reconstruction, and the final straw came when he ran as a Democrat in 1880. It would take nearly another century before Hancock's reputation and legacy were revived by Michael Sherrard's Killer Angels, a historical fiction about the Battle of Gettysburg that examined the friendship between Hancock and Confederate General Lewis Armistead, who was mortally wounded by Hancock's men during Pickett's charge. By the time Ken Burns' Civil War documentary had renewed interest in Gettysburg and the Civil War, Hancock was as popular as ever. Hancock the Superb, The Life and Career of General Winfield Scott Hancock, chronicles the life and career of one of the Union's most indispensable generals, humanizing the courageous and fiery man who was respected and admired by his men and his superiors alike. In this audiobook, you will learn about Winfield Scott Hancock like you never have before, in no time at all. Chapter 1. Early Years, 1824 to 1840. The Hancock-Hawksworth Family Tree. Winfield Scott Hancock and his identical twin brother Hilary Baker Hancock were born on February 14, 1824 in Montgomery Square, Pennsylvania, a village just northwest of Philadelphia in present-day Montgomery Township, to Benjamin Franklin Hancock and Elizabeth Hawksworth Hancock. A third son, John, was born around 1830. The Hancock and Hawksworth families, of English, Scottish, and Welsh descent, had lived in Montgomery County for several generations, where at the time of Winfield's birth, Benjamin was a country school teacher, though both the Hancocks and Hawksworths were generations of farmers. Winfield's grandfather, Richard, was a mariner who fought and was captured during the American Revolutionary War, spending the duration of the war in Great Britain's notorious Dartmoor prison. During the War of 1812, Richard organized one of the companies that garrisoned at Camp DuPont, Pennsylvania. Both Elizabeth's grandfather and father fought in the American Revolutionary War. Her grandfather was killed in battle while serving as a captain under General George Washington. Though he hoped his son would choose a path of life other than the military, Benjamin Hancock named his son Winfield Scott after the renowned U.S. Army general who came to be his nation's greatest military hero during the 19th century. Winfield Scott was best known for his role in the War of 1812, but over the course of his 47-year military career, he also commanded forces in the Mexican-American War, including commanding young Winfield Scott Hancock, the Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War. On the strength of his reputation, Winfield Scott was General-in-Chief for the Union during 1861. Life in Norristown. In early 1828, Benjamin and Elizabeth Hancock moved with their twin sons Winfield and Hilary from the countryside to the village of Norristown, Pennsylvania, set on giving their sons a better life than they themselves had. As the county seat, Norristown offered economic and educational opportunities the outlying countryside did not. Once there, Benjamin continued teaching and began studying law under John Freely, Esquire, while Elizabeth opened a milliner's shop selling women's hats from their home. On August 19, 1828, when Winfield was 4 years of age, his father Benjamin was admitted to the Montgomery County Bar Association. From that time on, the Hancock home functioned as half law office, half storefront. Becoming a family of some prominence, though far from financially well off, Benjamin became a deacon in the Norristown Baptist Church, participated in municipal government as Justice of the Peace, helped establish free schooling in Norristown, and later became collector of internal revenue. Prior to this time, the state of Pennsylvania endorsed subscription schools, most often one-room structures, run by a hired educator whose wages and board were paid by the community. Young Winfield Scott Hancock. History describes the young Winfield as tall, thin, and handsome, displaying early in life the heroic leadership qualities that would come to define him in adulthood. Said to have been sound of body, mind, and morals, he was captain of his school juvenile militia, a leader in sports, and was often chosen by his classmates to arbitrate boyish disputes. These same traits ensured that he was always relied upon to resolve disagreements expediently, using good common sense. Rebellions among his mock military ranks were routinely dealt with by dismissing rabble-rousers and sending them home to their mothers. From a very early age, Winfield is said to have displayed uncommon generosity and always championed the underdog. With no tolerance for bullies, one classmate later said of him, if a big boy undertook to worry a small boy, he'd find Winfield atop of him in short order. One often repeated anecdote illustrating his character took place when Winfield was about 11, when a little orphan boy named John Everman came to live with distant relatives in Norristown. As the youngest, smallest, and poorest boy at Norristown Public School, where he and Winfield attended, the bigger boys immediately set out to bully and tease him. Not only did Winfield fight his battles for him, he forced his classmates to make a place for him in their games, and even shared his pocket money with him. Winfield would form many lifelong friendships due to his affable and benevolent nature. As fate would have it, John W. Everman would go on to become a wealthy Philadelphia City Council member who would offer his service to Winfield when he returned to Philadelphia a famous major general. Norristown Academy, circa 1830 to 1836. Setting out from the start to provide their sons the best education possible, Benjamin and Elizabeth placed their sons at Norristown Academy, a private school where their first teacher was Eliphalet Roberts. After a few years, however, Winfield's father, who played a principal role in establishing the first free school system in the state and was an active member of the Norristown School Board, removed his sons in favor of a public school education. He hoped it would set an example for other parents. Norristown Public School, 1836 to 1840. Around 1836, Winfield and his brothers were removed from Norristown Academy in favor of attending the first public school opened in Norristown. Proving to be a studious and bright boy, in 1839, 15-year-old Winfield was chosen to read aloud the Declaration of Independence during the town's annual July 4th celebration. Chapter 2. West Point Military Academy, 1840 to 1844. In 1840, local Pennsylvania Congressman Joseph Bornitz, an influential man who both admired and respected Benjamin Hancock, nominated Winfield for a commission to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Though still not set on making a career of the military, as a young man who by name, family heritage, and natural disposition was undeniably militarily minded, it seemed the natural thing to do. And while Winfield's father had by this time become a prominent figure around Norristown, that by no means meant he could afford pricey universities like the University of Pennsylvania in nearby Philadelphia. While early narratives describe Winfield's attendance at West Point as esteemed and his application of himself brilliant, more recent accounts read his progress at West Point as merely average, which may be more accurate if his graduation rank is any indication. Winfield ultimately graduated 18th in a class of 25 in 1844. So that June he was commissioned brevet second lieutenant and assigned to the 6th Infantry of the U.S. Army. Ultimately, it was not how Winfield performed at West Point that made his time most memorable, but who he was performing with at the academy. Hancock would be remembered as one of a handful of West Point men who became the greatest generals of the Civil War, and the future general's years at West Point became a source of colorful stories about the man who became Civil War legends decades down the road. In 1846, a shy kid named Thomas Jonathan Jackson made few friends and struggled with his studies, finishing 17th in his class 15 years before becoming Stonewall, while George Pickett was more preoccupied with playing hooky at a local bar before finishing last in the same class as Jackson. Future Confederate Corps Commander A.P. Hill was already in love with the future wife of George McClellan, a young prodigy who finished second in the class of 1846, while the clerical error by West Point administrators ensured that Hiram Ulysses Grant became forever known as Ulysses S. Grant. Years after Robert E. Lee met Albert Sidney Johnston and Jefferson Davis at West Point, William Tecumseh Sherman roomed with principal subordinate George H. Thomas, and they were friends with Richard S. Ewell, the Corps commander who would replace Stonewall Jackson after Chancellorsville. And in the years that followed Thomas and Sherman, important Civil War generals in the West went to school together, including John Bell Hood, Phil Sheridan, and James Birdseye McPherson, who had become the only commanding general of a Union army to die in a Civil War battle when he fell in 1864 during Sherman's Atlanta campaign. During his 4 years, Winfield himself was on campus at one time or another with George B. McClellan, Ulysses S. Grant, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, William Baldy Smith, and James Longstreet. Chapter 3. Early Military Life in Mexico, 1844 to 1848. Red River Valley. Soon after leaving West Point, it became apparent to those around him that Brevet Second Lieutenant Winfield Scott Hancock carried significant ambition and personally hoped to bring honor to his parents and the country he was now sworn to serve. Earnest, industrious, conscientious, and vocally patriotic, by all accounts, Hancock had the makings of a successful soldier. On July 1, 1844, Brevet Second Lieutenant Hancock was ordered to report to his 6th Infantry Regiment at Red River on the western frontier, in the Red River Valley of present-day North Dakota and Minnesota. As the only policing authority in the region, it was the duty of the U.S. Army at that time to protect settlers as they slowly pushed their way across the frontier. Stationed first at Fort Towson and then Fort Washita, Hancock's time there was largely uneventful, aside from the occasional Indian incident, with little opportunity for glory and little expected. After nearly 2 years of undistinguished duty, on June 18, 1864, Hancock received his commission as full second lieutenant. Kentucky. When war broke out with Mexico in 1846, Second Lieutenant Hancock hoped he'd be sent to the front, but made no formal request to join the action. Transferred instead from Fort Washita to Newport Barracks, Kentucky, he was assigned to recruiting duties, proving so proficient at signing up soldiers that his superiors were reluctant to ever release him from his post. Mexico. In July 1847, Hancock was finally sent to join the 6th Infantry in Puebla, Mexico, where his unit became part of the Army under the command of Winfield's namesake, General Winfield Scott. After advancing inland from Puebla virtually unopposed, General Scott's army attacked Mexico City from the south. In August of that year, Second Lieutenant Hancock encountered warfare for the first time, displaying exceptional bravery at the battles of Contreras and Churubusco on August 20, 1847, after which he was appointed a brevet first lieutenant. Wounded in the knee at Churubusco, Hancock developed a fever, and though well enough to lead his regiment at Molino del Rey on September 8th, high fever kept him from participating in the final breakthrough to Mexico City, something he is said to have regretted for the remainder of his life. After the final victory, Brevet First Lieutenant Hancock remained in Mexico with the 6th Infantry until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. Chapter 4. Antebellum Life and Career, 1848 to 1861. After returning from Mexico in February of 1848, Hancock reverted back to second lieutenant and served at a number of posts as an Army quartermaster and adjutant, based primarily at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and St. Louis, Missouri. It was at St. Louis that he was finally promoted to full first lieutenant. While serving as Army quartermaster and adjutant of his unit in St. Louis, Missouri, First Lieutenant Winfield Scott Hancock met Almira Allie Russell, daughter of a prominent St. Louis, Missouri merchant, in 1849. After a quick courtship, the couple was married on January 24, 1850, eventually having 2 children together, Russell in 1850 and Ada in 1857. Unfortunately, neither child would outlive their parents. Ada died in 1875, and Russell died in 1884. After serving as quartermaster in a number of posts, Hancock was promoted to captain and assigned to Fort Myers, Florida in 1855, where his new family accompanied him. In fact, his wife was the only woman on the post. Despite the promotion, his assignment was largely coinciding with the end of the Third Seminole War, and he primarily retained his duties as a quartermaster, keeping him from seeing action in that campaign. Bleeding Kansas. While Hancock was cycling through various assignments across the country, the United States was trying to sort out its intractable issues. In an attempt to organize the center of North America, Kansas and Nebraska, without offsetting the slave rebalance, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act eliminated the Missouri Compromise line of 1820, which the Compromise of 1850 had maintained. The Missouri Compromise had stipulated that states north of the boundary line determined in that bill would be free, and that states south of it could have slavery. This was essential to maintaining the balance of slave and free states in the Union. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, however, ignored the line completely and proposed that all new territories be organized by popular sovereignty. Settlers could vote whether they wanted their state to be slave or free. When popular sovereignty became the standard in Kansas and Nebraska, the primary result was that thousands of zealous pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates both moved to Kansas to influence the vote, creating a dangerous and ultimately deadly mix. Numerous attacks took place between the two sides, and many pro-slavery Missourians organized attacks on Kansas towns just across the border. The best-known abolitionist in Bleeding Kansas was a middle-aged man named John Brown. A radical abolitionist, Brown organized a small band of like-minded followers and fought with the armed groups of pro-slavery men in Kansas for several months, including a notorious incident known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, in which Brown's supporters murdered 5 men. Over 50 people died before John Brown left the territory, which ultimately entered the Union as a free state in 1859. When hostilities in Florida finally quieted down, Captain Hancock was reassigned to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he served with his 6th Infantry in the anti-slavery Bleeding Kansas border war during the mid-1850s. Eventually, Hancock was stationed in the Utah Territory, where he was present for the conclusion of the Utah War Mormon Rebellion in July of 1858. After a peaceful resolution to the Utah War Mormon Rebellion was negotiated, in November of 1858, Hancock was transferred to Los Angeles in Southern California, where he remained until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Again, he was joined by wife Allie and their children, and he continued serving as a captain and assistant quartermaster under Albert Sidney Johnston, who was just a few years away from being the Confederacy's most prominent general. While stationed in Los Angeles, Captain Hancock befriended a number of men who would later become Confederate officers, famously becoming particularly close with Virginian Lewis A. Armistead, who would rise to the rank of Brigadier General of the Confederate Army and oppose Hancock at Gettysburg. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Armistead and the other Southerners left to join the Confederate States Army, while Hancock remained in the service of the Federal Union forces. Chapter 5. Heading for Civil War. Harper's Ferry. After his activities in Kansas, John Brown spent the next few years raising money in New England, which would bring him into direct contact with important abolitionist leaders, including Frederick Douglass. Brown had previously organized a small raiding party that succeeded in raiding a Missouri farm and freeing 11 slaves, but he set his sights on far larger objectives. In 1859, Brown began to set a new plan in motion that he hoped would create a full-scale slave uprising in the South. Brown's plan relied on raiding Harper's Ferry, a strategically located armory in western Virginia that had been the main federal arms depot after the Revolution. Given its proximity to the South, Brown hoped to seize thousands of rifles and move them south, gathering slaves and swelling his numbers as he went. The slaves would then be armed and ready to help free more slaves, inevitably fighting Southern militias along the way. In recognition of how important escaped slave Frederick Douglass had become among abolitionists, Brown attempted to enlist the support of Douglass by informing him of the plans. While Douglass didn't blow the whistle on Brown, he told Brown that violence would only further enrage the South, and slaveholders might only retaliate further against slaves with devastating consequences. Instead of helping Brown, Douglass dissuaded freed blacks from joining Brown's group because he believed it was doomed to fail. Despite that, in July 1859, Brown traveled to Harper's Ferry under an assumed name and waited for his recruits, but he struggled to get even 20 people to join him. Rather than call off the plan, however, Brown went ahead with it. That fall, Brown and his men used hundreds of rifles to seize the armory at Harper's Ferry. But the plan went haywire from the start, and word of its attack quickly spread. Local pro-slavery men formed a militia and pinned Brown and his men down while they were still at the armory. After being called to Harper's Ferry, Robert E. Lee took decisive command of a troop of Marines stationed there, surrounded the arsenal, and gave Brown the opportunity to surrender peaceably. When Brown refused, Lee ordered the doors be broken down and Brown taken captive, an affair that reportedly lasted just 3 minutes. A few of Brown's men were killed, but Brown was taken alive. Lee earned acclaim for accomplishing this task so quickly and efficiently. Young J.E.B. Stuart played an active role in opposing the raid at Harper's Ferry. In October of 1859, while conducting business in Washington, D.C., Stuart volunteered to carry secret instructions to Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee and then accompany him and a squad of U.S. military militia to Harper's Ferry, where Brown had staged a raid on the armory. While delivering Lee's written ultimatum to the leader of the raid, who was going by the pseudonym Isaac Smith, Stuart remembered Old Osawatomie Brown from the events at Bleeding, Kansas, and ultimately assisted in his arrest. The fallout from John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was intense. Southerners had long suspected that abolitionists hoped to arm the slaves and use violence to abolish slavery, and Brown's raid seemed to confirm that. Meanwhile, much of the Northern press praised Brown for his actions. In the South, conspiracy theories ran wild about who had supported the raid, and many believed prominent abolitionist Republicans had been behind the raid as well. On the day of his execution, Brown wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." The man in command of the troops present at Brown's hanging was none other than Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who was ordered to Charlestown in November 1859. After Brown's hanging, the future Stonewall Jackson began to believe war was inevitable, but he wrote his aunt, "I think we have great reason for alarm, but my trust is in God, and I cannot think that he will permit the madness of man to interfere so materially with the Christian labors of this country at home and abroad." The election of 1860. In his memoirs, General James Longstreet summed up the national mood in the 1850s, likening it to a war cloud. Officers of the northern and southern states were anxious to see the portending storm pass by or disperse, and on many occasions we, too, were assured, by those who claimed to look into the future, that the statesman would yet show himself equal to the occasion and restore confidence among the people. Clearly, men like Longstreet were hoping at the time for some sort of grand compromise that would avert war. But by the fall of 1860, everyone could see the war cloud on the horizon. With the election of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln as president on November 6, 1860, many Southerners considered it the final straw. Someone they knew as a black Republican, leader of a party whose central platform was to stop the spread of slavery to new states, was now set to be inaugurated as president in March. Throughout the fall and winter of 1860, Southern calls for secession became increasingly serious. In a last-ditch effort to save the Union, Kentucky Senator John Crittenden tried to assume the stateliness of his predecessor Henry Clay. Crittenden, however, proved to be no Henry Clay. His proposal that a constitutional amendment reinstate the Missouri Compromise line and extend it to the Pacific failed. President Buchanan supported the measure, but President-elect Lincoln said he refused to allow the further expansion of slavery under any conditions. The Crittenden Compromise failed on December 18th. 2 days later, South Carolina seceded from the Union. President Buchanan sat on his hands, believing the Southern states had no right to secede, but that the federal government had no effective power to prevent secession. In January, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Kansas followed South Carolina's lead. The Confederacy was formed on February 4th in Montgomery, Alabama, with former Secretary of War Jefferson Davis as its president. On February 23rd, Texas joined the Confederacy. Chapter 6. The Start of the Civil War, 1861. Fort Sumter. Lincoln's predecessor was among those who could see the potential conflict coming from a mile away. As the Confederacy continued to grow during his last months in office, President James Buchanan instructed the Federal Army to permit the Confederacy to take control of forts in its territory, hoping to avoid a war. Conveniently, this also allowed Southern forces to take control of important ports and land ahead of a potential war, which would make secession and/or a victory in a military conflict easier. Many Southern partisans within the federal government at the end of 1860 took advantage of those opportunities to help Southern states ahead of time. One of the forts in the South was Fort Sumter, an important but undermanned and undersupplied fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Buchanan attempted to resupply Fort Sumter in the first few months of 1860, but the attempt failed when Southern sympathizers in the harbor fired on the resupply ship. In his inauguration speech, President Lincoln struck a moderate tone. Unlike most inauguration addresses, which are typically followed by balls and a honeymoon period, Lincoln's came amid a major political crisis. To reassure the South, he reiterated his belief in the legal status of slavery in the South, but that its expansion into the Western territories was to be restricted. He outlined the illegality of secession and refused to acknowledge the South's secession, and promised to continue to deliver U.S. mail in the seceded states. Most importantly, he pledged to not use force unless his obligation to protect federal property was restricted. In doing this, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property in places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. Lincoln had promised that it would not be the North that started a potential war, but he was also aware of the possibility of the South initiating conflict. Although he vowed not to fire the first shot, Lincoln was likely aware that his attempt to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor would draw Southern fire. It had already happened under Buchanan's watch. After his inauguration, President Lincoln informed South Carolina Governor Francis Pickens that he was sending supplies to the undermanned garrison at Fort Sumter. When Lincoln made clear that he would attempt to resupply the fort, Davis ordered Beauregard to demand its surrender and prevent the resupplying of the garrison. In early April, the ship Lincoln sent to resupply the fort was fired upon and turned around. On April 9th, Confederate President Davis sent word to General Beauregard to demand the fort's evacuation. At the time, the federal garrison consisted of Major Robert Anderson, Beauregard's artillery instructor from West Point, and 76 troops. Even before the bombardment, upon learning that he was opposed by Beauregard, Anderson remarked that the Southern forces in Charleston Harbor would be exercised with skill and sound judgment. Beauregard also remembered his former superior, and before the bombardment, he sent brandy, whiskey, and cigars to Anderson and his garrison, gifts the major refused. At 4:30 a.m. on the morning of April 12, 1861, Beauregard ordered the first shots to be fired at Fort Sumter, effectively igniting the Civil War. After nearly 34 hours and thousands of rounds fired from 47 artillery guns and mortars ringing the harbor, on April 14, 1861, Major Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter, marking the first Confederate victory. No casualties were suffered on either side during the dueling bombardments across Charleston Harbor. But, ironically, 2 Union soldiers were killed by an accidental explosion during the surrender ceremonies. After the attack on Fort Sumter, support for both the Northern and Southern cause rose. 2 days later, Lincoln issued a call to arms asking for 75,000 volunteers. That led to the secession of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas, with the loyalty of border states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri still somewhat up in the air. The large number of Southern sympathizers in these states buoyed the Confederates' hopes that those too would soon join the South. Moreover, the loss of these border states, especially Virginia, all deeply depressed Lincoln. Just weeks before, prominent Virginians had reassured Lincoln that the state's historic place in American history made its citizens eager to save the Union. But as soon as Lincoln made any assertive moves to save the Union, Virginia seceded. This greatly concerned Lincoln, who worried Virginia's secession made it more likely other border states and/or Maryland would secede as well. Sheridan would later recall, "The news of the firing on Fort Sumter brought us an excitement which overshadowed all else. and though we had no officers at the post who sympathized with the rebellion, there were several in our regiment, the 4th Infantry, who did, and we were considerably exercised as to the course they might pursue, but naturally far more so concerning the disposition that would be made of the regiment during the conflict. Despite the loss of Fort Sumter, the North expected a relatively quick victory. Their expectations weren't unrealistic due to the Union's overwhelming economic advantages over the South. At the start of the war, the Union had a population of over 22 million. The South had a population of 9 million, nearly 4 million of whom were slaves. Union states contained 90% of the manufacturing capacity of the country and 97% of the weapon manufacturing capacity. Union states also possessed over 70% of the total railroads in the pre-war United States at the start of the war, and the Union also controlled 80% of the shipbuilding capacity of the pre-war United States. However, Sheridan was not as optimistic, later claiming in his memoirs, "I was deeply solicitous as to the course of events, and though I felt confident that in the end the just cause of the government must triumph, yet the thoroughly crystallized organization which the Southern Confederacy quickly exhibited disquieted me very much, for it alone was evidence that the Southern leaders had long anticipated the struggle and prepared for it." Joining the Army of the Potomac. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Captain Winfield Scott Hancock was the chief quartermaster of the military depot in Los Angeles, in Southern California. Hancock hosted a farewell dinner for the comrades who were departing California to join the Confederate Army. But he was an ardent Union man, and he went about helping secure Los Angeles from the Californians who favored and planned to support the South. On July 22, 1861, the day after Union forces suffered their devastating defeat at Bull Run, President Lincoln summoned McClellan to Washington, providing a special train to bring him from Wheeling through Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and on to D.C., where he was met by enthusiastic crowds and adoring fans at each stop. Upon his arrival on July 26th, McClellan was placed in command of the Department of the Potomac, the Union Army of the East, charged with defending Washington, D.C., and the destruction of the Confederate forces in northern and eastern Virginia. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land," apparently believing it was now his providence to save his country. "I almost think that were I to win some small success now, I could become dictator or anything else that might please me, but nothing of that kind would please me. Therefore I won't be dictator." Admirable self-denial. More accurately, McClellan had been given this new responsibility simply because he had given the Union its only successes to date. When Captain Hancock traveled east to get involved in the war effort in September 1861, he expected to assume quartermaster duties for the rapidly growing Union Army. Upon arrival in Washington, D.C. on September 23, 1861, however, General McClellan appointed him a brigadier general of infantry volunteers in Brigadier General William F. Baldy Smith's division in the newly organized Army of the Potomac. Chapter 7. Hancock the Superb. Historians who are critical of McClellan's generalship in the field are unanimous in their praise of McClellan's organizational skills. Displaying outstanding organizational and logistical skills, General McClellan quickly whipped the disheartened Union Army into a tight-knit fighting unit with high morale, a highly efficient staff, and optimal supporting services. Just as much, the nearly 175,000-man army loved Little Mac. McClellan also turned Washington, D.C. into the most fortified spot on the continent, ringing it with forts that would make the city all but invulnerable to attack if manned. All that now lay ahead was for McClellan to take the offensive Lincoln had entrusted in him, to march his men into the southern states and capture Richmond, and demolish Confederate forces in the process. But even by the fall of 1861, Little Mac, as he was now commonly called, still refused to follow President Lincoln's mandate, claiming that his army was still unprepared. Displaying both arrogance and reluctance to fight, McClellan demanded more men, supplies, and time to better prepare, refusing to even meet with the president to share his plan of attack on the Confederate capital. As Lincoln's frustrations began to grow, McClellan's stated opposition to emancipation of slaves angered the radical Republicans who comprised an important bloc in Congress. Finally, in March of 1862, after 9 months in command, General McClellan began his invasion of Virginia, initiating what would become known as the Peninsula Campaign. Showing his proclivity for turning movement and grand strategy, McClellan completely shifted the theater of operations. Rather than march directly into Richmond and use his superior numbers to assert domination, He opted to exploit the Union sea dominance and move his army via an immense naval flotilla down the Potomac into Chesapeake Bay and land at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, at the southern tip of the Virginia Peninsula. In addition to his 130,000 men, he moved 15,000 horses and mules by this means as well. There he planned for an additional 80,000 men to join him, at which time he would advance westward to Richmond. One of the European observers likened the launch of the campaign to the stride of a giant. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign has been analyzed meticulously and is considered one of the grandest failures of the Union war effort, with McClellan made the scapegoat. In actuality, there was plenty of blame to go around, including Lincoln and his administration, which was so concerned about Stonewall Jackson's army in the Shenandoah Valley that several Union armies were left in the valley to defend Washington, D.C., and even more were held back from McClellan for fear of the capital's safety. The administration also micromanaged the deployment of certain divisions, and with Stanton's decision to shut down recruiting stations in early 1862, combined with the Confederacy concentrating all their troops in the area, the Army of the Potomac was eventually outnumbered in front of Richmond. At the beginning of the campaign, however, McClellan had vastly superior numbers at his disposal, with only about 70,000 Confederate troops on the entirety of the peninsula, and fewer than 17,000 between him and the capital. McClellan was unaware of this decisive advantage, however, because of the intelligence reports he kept receiving from Allen Pinkerton, which vastly overstated the number of available Confederate soldiers. Yorktown. From the beginning, McClellan's caution and the narrow width of the peninsula worked against his army. At Yorktown, which had been the site of a decisive siege during the Revolution, McClellan's initial hopes of surrounding and enveloping the Confederate lines through the use of the Navy was scuttled when the Navy couldn't promise that it'd be able to operate in the area. That allowed General John Magruder, whose Confederate forces were outmanned nearly 4-1, to hold Yorktown for the entire month of April. Magruder accomplished it by completely deceiving the Federals, at times marching his men in circles to make McClellan think his army was many times larger. Other times, he spread his artillery batteries across the line and fired liberally and sporadically at the Union lines, just to give the impression that the Confederates had huge numbers. The ruse worked, leaving the Union command thinking there were 100,000 Confederates. As a result of the misimpressions, McClellan chose not to attack Yorktown in force, instead opting to lay siege to it. In part, this was due to the decisive advantage the Union had in siege equipment, including massive mortars and artillery. The siege successfully captured Yorktown in early May with only about 500 casualties. But Magruder bought enough time for General Joseph E. Johnston to march south and confront McClellan on the peninsula. Williamsburg. As chance would have it, the first Union general to distinguish himself during the Peninsula Campaign was none other than Winfield Scott Hancock, who experienced his first major action of the Civil War on May 5, 1862, at the Battle of Williamsburg, Virginia. After withdrawing from Yorktown, McClellan sent Stoneman's cavalry in pursuit and attempted to move swiftly enough to cut off Johnston's retreat by use of Navy ships. At the Battle of Williamsburg, which the Confederates fought as a delaying action to retreat, Hancock led his brigade in a successful flanking attack against General Longstreet's Confederates and quickly occupied 2 abandoned Confederate strongholds. Hancock's brigade then sharply repulsed a Confederate assault by the 24th Virginia Regiment. At this point, Hancock had been ordered by General Edwin Bull Sumner to pull back his men to Cub Creek, but he instead decided to hold his ground, and his men repulsed an assault by the 5th North Carolina Regiment in short order. As Confederate General D.H. Hill scrambled to stop that regiment's assault, Hancock's men counterattacked and drove them off the field, inflicting nearly 1,000 casualties on the 2 regiments that had attacked his brigade and losing just 100. The Battle of Williamsburg was ultimately inconclusive, with the Confederates suffering 1,600 casualties and the Army of the Potomac suffering 2,200. But McClellan labeled it a brilliant victory over superior forces. While that was inaccurate, the press accounts of Hancock's performance fairly earned him national renown, and McClellan telegraphed Washington to report, "Hancock was superb today." Hancock had just forever won the nickname Hancock the Superb. Chapter 8. Fair Oaks and the 7 Days' Battles. After Williamsburg, the Union Army still had a nearly 2-to-1 advantage in manpower, so Johnston continued to gradually pull his troops back to a line of defense near Richmond as McClellan advanced. In conjunction, the U.S. Navy began moving its operations further up the James River until it could get within 7 miles of the Confederate capital before being opposed by a Southern fort. McClellan continued to attempt to turn Johnston's flank until the two armies were facing each other along the Chickahominy River. McClellan's Army of the Potomac got close enough to Richmond that they could see the city's church steeples. By the end of May, Stonewall Jackson had startlingly defeated 3 separate Northern armies in the valley, inducing Lincoln to hold back the One Corps from McClellan. When McClellan was forced to extend his line north to link up with troops that he expected to be sent overland to him, Johnston learned that McClellan was moving along the Chickahominy River. It was at this point that Johnston got uncharacteristically aggressive. Johnston had run out of breathing space for his army, and he believed McClellan was seeking to link up with McDowell's forces. Moreover, about a third of McClellan's army was south of the river, including Hancock's brigade and the Four Corps, while the other parts of the army were still north of it, offering Johnston an enticing target. Therefore, he drew up a very complex plan of attack for different wings of his army and struck at the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31, 1862. Like McDowell's plan for First Bull Run, the plan proved too complicated for Johnston's army to execute, and after a day of bloody fighting, little was accomplished from a technical standpoint. At one point during the Battle of Seven Pines, Confederates under General James Longstreet marched in the wrong direction down the wrong road, causing congestion and confusion among other Confederate units, and ultimately weakening the effectiveness of the massive Confederate counterattack launched against McClellan. By the time the fighting was finished, nearly 40,000 had been engaged on both sides, and it was the biggest battle in the Eastern Theater to date, second only to Shiloh at the time. However, McClellan was rattled by the attack, and Johnston was seriously wounded during the fighting, resulting in military advisor Robert E. Lee being sent to assume command of the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan confided to his wife, "I am tired of the sickening sight of the battlefield, with its mangled corpses and poor suffering wounded. Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such cost." The 7 Days Battles. Although the Battle of Seven Pines was tactically inconclusive, McClellan's resolve to keep pushing forward vanished. He maneuvered his army so that it was all south of the Chickahominy. But as he settled in for an expected siege, Lee went about preparing Richmond's defenses and devising his own aggressive attacks. With more Confederate troops swelling the ranks, Lee's army was McClellan's equal by late June, and on June 25th, Lee commenced an all-out attempt to destroy McClellan's army in a series of fierce battles known as the 7 Days Battles. After a stalemate in the first fighting at Oak Grove, Lee's army kept pushing ahead, using Stonewall Jackson to attack McClellan's right. Although Stonewall Jackson was unusually lethargic during the week's fighting, the appearance of his foot cavalry spooked McClellan even more, and McClellan was now certain he was opposed by 200,000 men, more than double the actual size of Lee's army. It also made McClellan think that the Confederates were threatening his supply line, forcing him to shift his army toward the James River to draw supplies. On June 26th, the Union defenders sharply repulsed the Confederate attacks at Mechanicsville, in part due to the fact that Stonewall Jackson had his troops bivouac for the night, despite the fact heavy gunfire indicating a large battle was popping off within earshot. When the Confederates had more success the next day at Gaines Mills, McClellan continued his strategic retreat, maneuvering his army toward a defensive position on the James River and all but abandoning the siege. McClellan managed to keep his forces intact, mostly through the efforts of his field generals, ultimately retreating to Harrison's Landing on the James River and establishing a new base of operation. Feeling increasingly at odds with his superiors, in a letter sent from Gaines Mills, Virginia, dated June 28, 1862, a frustrated McClellan wrote to Secretary of War Stanton, "If I save the army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to any other person in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." McClellan's argument, however, flies in the face of common knowledge that he had become so obsessed with having sufficient supplies that he'd actually moved to Gaines Mill to accommodate the massive amount of provisions he'd accumulated. Ultimately unable to move his cache of supplies as quickly as his men were needed, McClellan eventually ran railroad cars full of food and supplies into the Pamunkey River rather than leave them behind for the Confederates. Despite the fact all of Lee's battle plans had been poorly executed by his generals, particularly Stonewall Jackson, he ordered one final assault against McClellan's army at Malvern Hill. Incredibly, McClellan was not even on the field for that battle, having left by a steamboat back to Harrison's Landing. Biographer Ethan Rafuse notes McClellan's absence from the battlefield was inexcusable, literally leaving the Army of the Potomac leaderless during pitched battle. But McClellan often behaved coolly under fire, so it is likely not a question of McClellan's personal courage. Ironically, Malvern Hill was one of the Union Army's biggest successes during the Peninsula Campaign. Union artillery had silenced its Confederate counterparts, but Lee still ordered an infantry attack by D.H. Hill's division, which never got within 100 yards of the Union line. After the war, Hill famously referred to Malvern Hill. It wasn't war, it was murder. Later that evening, as General Isaac Trimble, who is best known for leading a division during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, began moving his troops forward as if to attack, he was stopped by Stonewall Jackson, who asked, "What are you going to do?" When Trimble replied that he was going to charge, Jackson countered, "General Hill has just tried with his entire division and been repulsed. I guess you'd better not try it." After Malvern Hill, McClellan withdrew his army to Harrison's Landing, where it was protected by the U.S. Navy along the James River, and had its flanks secured by the river itself. At this point, the bureaucratic bickering between McClellan and Washington, D.C. started flaring up again, as McClellan refused to recommence an advance without reinforcements. After weeks of indecision, the Army of the Potomac was finally ordered to evacuate the peninsula and link up with John Pope's army in northern Virginia, as the administration was more comfortable having their forces fighting on one line instead of exterior lines. Upon his arrival in Washington, McClellan told reporters that his failure to defeat Lee in Virginia was due to Lincoln not sending sufficient reinforcements. Chapter 9. Second Bull Run. Even before McClellan had completely withdrawn his troops, Lee sent Jackson northward to intercept the new army Abraham Lincoln had placed under Major General John Pope, formed out of the scattered troops in the Virginia area. Pope had found success in the Western theater, and he was uncommonly brash, instructing the previously defeated men now under his command that his soldiers in the West were accustomed to seeing the backs of the enemy. Pope's arrogance turned off his own men, and it also caught the notice of Lee. Once certain McClellan was in full retreat, Lee joined Jackson, planning to strike Pope before McClellan's troops could arrive as reinforcements. In August 1862, Stuart completed yet another ride around the Union Army, though this one was not as historic or memorable. On August 21st, while conducting a series of highly effective raids against Union forces, Stuart was nearly captured and did lose his signature peacock-plumed hat and cloak. But the following day he managed to overrun Union Commander Major General John Pope's headquarters during a raid on Catlet Station, Virginia, not only capturing Pope's full uniform, but several staff officers and secret orders that provided Lee invaluable intelligence concerning troop reinforcements for Pope's army. In late August 1862, in a daring and unorthodox move, Lee divided his forces and sent Jackson northward to flank them, ultimately bringing Jackson directly behind Pope's army and supply base. This forced Pope to fall back to Manassas and protect his flank and maintain his lines of communication. Recognizing Lee's genius for military strategy, General Jackson quickly became Lee's most trusted commander, and he would later say that he so trusted Lee's military instincts that he would even follow him into battle blindfolded. When Pope's army fell back to Manassas to confront Jackson, his wing of Lee's army dug in along a railroad trench and took a defensive stance. The Second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, was fought August 28th through 30th, beginning with the Union Army throwing itself at Jackson the first 2 days. But the concentration on Stonewall's men opened up on the Union Army's left flank for Longstreet's wing, which marched 30 miles in 24 hours to reach the battlefield by the late afternoon of August 29th. When Longstreet's men finally arrived around noon on August 29th, Lee informed Longstreet of his plan to attack the Union flank, which was at that time concentrating its efforts on General Jackson. Longstreet initially rejected Lee's suggestion to attack, recommending instead that a reconnaissance be conducted to survey the field. And although Longstreet's artillery was ultimately a major factor in helping Jackson resist the Union attack on August 29th, his performance that day was described by some Lost Cause advocates as slow, and they considered his disobedience of General Lee insubordination. Lee's most famous biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman, later wrote, "The seeds of much of the disaster on July 2, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg were sown in that instant, when Lee yielded to Longstreet and Longstreet discovered that he would." Nevertheless, the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, is considered one of Longstreet's most successful. While Jackson's men defended themselves the first 2 days, Lee used Longstreet's wing on August 30th to deliver a devastating flank attack before reinforcements from the retreating Army of the Potomac could reach the field. With over 25,000 men, Longstreet's attack lasted several hours, while he and Lee were in the thick of things directing brigades and artillery batteries while coming under fire themselves. Eventually, Longstreet's attack swept Pope's army off the field. Fought on the same ground as the First Battle of Manassas nearly a year earlier, the result was the same, a decisive Confederate victory that sent Union soldiers scrambling back to the safety of Washington. Longstreet called Lee's campaign clever and brilliant, and it helped reinforce the belief that using offensive marching and defensive battle tactics, like having Jackson's wing flank Pope's army and forcing Pope to attack it, was the key to success. McClellan was not in command at Second Bull Run, but he generated substantial controversy over whether he moved with speed to come to Pope's aid. What is unmistakable is that McClellan would feel vindicated when Pope was embarrassed, at one point mentioning that one possibility for the campaign is to let Pope attempt to get out of his scrape. Lincoln would later accuse McClellan flat out of acting badly during the campaign. Very few of the men of the Army of the Potomac participated at all at the battle, and the most memorable of those who did were fighting under Fitz-John Porter. At the Battle of Second Bull Run, Porter's corps was sent to reinforce Pope's army, and on August 29th, he was ordered to attack the flank and rear of Stonewall Jackson's corps, while also maintaining contact with General John Reynolds' division. Achieving both of those at the same time was impossible, and Pope's orders were made without knowledge that General Longstreet's wing of the army had arrived on the battlefield, meaning Porter was right not to attempt an attack. On August 30th, Pope again ordered the flank attack, and this time Porter reluctantly complied. As his corps turned to head toward Jackson's right and attacked, it left his own right flank in the air, allowing Longstreet's offensive with 30,000 Confederates to devour Porter's 5,000 men and roll up the Union line. Once the battle was over, Pope blamed the debacle on Porter's supposed insubordination and relieved him of command on September 5th, effectively ending Porter's career. That November, Porter was court-martialed for his actions at Second Bull Run, done in mostly due to his association with McClellan and his criticism of Pope. It would take him nearly 3 more decades to clear his name. Chapter 10. The Maryland Campaign. Lee invades Maryland. After 2 days of fighting, Lee had achieved another major victory, and he now stood unopposed 12 miles away from Washington, D.C. While Johnston and Beauregard had stayed in this position in the months after the first battle, Lee determined upon a more aggressive course, taking the fighting to the north. In early September, convinced that the best way to defend Richmond was to divert attention to Washington, Lee had decided to invade Maryland after obtaining Jefferson Davis' permission. Today, the decision is remembered through the prism of Lee hoping to win a major battle in the North that would bring about European recognition of the Confederacy, potential intervention, and possible capitulation by the North, whose anti-war Democrats were picking up political momentum. However, Lee also hoped that the fighting in Maryland would relieve Virginia's resources, especially the Shenandoah Valley, which served as the state's breadbasket. And though largely forgotten today, Lee's move was controversial among his own men. Confederate soldiers, including Lee, took up arms to defend their homes, but now they were being asked to invade a northern state. An untold number of Confederate soldiers refused to cross the Potomac River into Maryland. Despite that, Longstreet also held the same view as Lee, believing an invasion of Maryland had plenty of advantages. He wrote in his memoirs, "The Army of Northern Virginia was a field without a foe. Its once grand adversary, discomfited under 2 commanders, had crept into cover of the bulwarks about the national capital. The commercial, social, and blood ties of Maryland inclined her people to the Southern cause. A little way north of the Potomac were inviting fields of food and supplies, more plentiful than on the southern side, and the fields for march and maneuver, strategy and tactics were even more inviting than the broad fields of grain and comfortable pasture lands. Propitious also was the prospect of swelling our ranks by Maryland recruits." In the summer of 1862, the Union suffered more than 20,000 casualties, and Northern Democrats, who had been split into pro-war and anti-war factions from the beginning, increasingly began to question the war. As of September 1862, no progress had been made on Richmond. In fact, a Confederate army was now in Maryland, and with the election of 1862 approaching, Lincoln feared the Republicans might suffer losses in the congressional midterms that would harm the war effort. Thus, he restored General McClellan and removed General Pope after the second disaster at Bull Run. McClellan was still immensely popular among the Army of the Potomac, and with a mixture of men from his Army of the Potomac and Pope's Army of Virginia, he began a cautious pursuit of Lee into Maryland. Although McClellan had largely stayed out of the political fray through 1862, McClellan's most ardent supporters could not deny that he actively worked to delay reinforcing Pope during the Second Manassas Campaign once the Army of the Potomac was evacuated from the peninsula. Nevertheless, McClellan ultimately got what he wanted out of Pope's misfortune. Though there is some debate on the order of events that led to McClellan taking command, Lincoln ultimately restored McClellan to command, likely because McClellan was the only administrator who could reform the army quickly and efficiently. McClellan didn't have much time to reorganize the mob, with Lee's army crossing the Potomac in early September. The Lost Order. Naturally, McClellan's ascension to command of the armies around Washington outraged the Republican segment of the administration, making it even more ironic that McClellan's campaign into Maryland during the next few weeks would bring about the release of the Emancipation Proclamation. Once again, McClellan correctly predicted Lee's movements, and now realized that Lee was not the timid, indecisive general McClellan initially thought. Though it was clear Lee had crossed the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia decided to use ridges and cavalry to screen their movements. McClellan believed the most realistic goal was to drive the Confederates out of Maryland. The Army of the Potomac understandably moved conservatively into Maryland during the early portion of the campaign, while still dealing with logistics. Meanwhile, a Pleasanton report reaching McClellan estimated the rebel force at 100,000, and other reports couldn't ascertain the nature of that army's movements or motives. McClellan told the administration on September 10th that the estimates of the rebel force put it somewhere between 80 to 150,000, which would obviously have a huge effect on the campaign. Historians believe that Lee's entire Army of Northern Virginia had perhaps 50,000 men at most, and possibly closer to 30,000 during the Maryland campaign. However, Lee sized up George McClellan, figuring he was a cautious general, and decided once again to divide his forces throughout Maryland. In early September, he ordered Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry while he and Longstreet maneuvered his troops toward Frederick. With McClellan now assuming command of the Northern forces, Lee expected to have plenty of time to assemble his troops and bring his battle plan to fruition. However, the North was about to have one of the greatest strokes of luck during the Civil War. For reasons that are still unclear, Union troops in camp at Frederick came across a copy of Special Order 191, wrapped up among 3 cigars. The order contained Lee's entire marching plans for Maryland, making it clear that the Army of Northern Virginia had been divided into multiple parts, which, if faced by overpowering strength, could be entirely defeated and bagged. The Lost Order quickly made its way to General McClellan, who took several hours to debate whether or not it was intentional misinformation or actually real. McClellan is usually faulted for not acting quickly enough on these orders, but much of the instructions are vague and seemingly contradicted recent rebel movements. Of course, there was also a concern that the orders could be false. Regardless, by noon of that day, McClellan was confident of success and told Lincoln that he would send trophies. Once he decided it was accurate, McClellan is said to have famously boasted, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Ironically, the orders may have reinforced McClellan's belief that Lee's army had a significant advantage in manpower through its vague wording of commands. The North's luck was helped by Stuart, who had no clue orders had been lost and was busy handling public relations instead of reconnaissance. Now officially designated the Eyes of the Army in September of 1862, Stuart committed what many military historians deem his first tactical error when, for a 5-day period at the beginning of the Maryland campaign, he rested his men and entertained local civilians at a gala ball at Urbana, Maryland, rather than keep the Union enemy under surveillance. With no incoming intelligence, Lee was unaware of McClellan's location and the speed at which his forces approached. Harper's Ferry. The Confederates were completely unaware of the North's luck as they began to carry out Lee's plans. To Jackson's advantage, Colonel Dixon S. Miles, Union commander at Harper's Ferry, had insisted on keeping most of his troops near the town instead of taking up commanding positions on the most important position, Maryland Heights. On September 12th, Confederate forces engaged the Union's marginal defenses on the Heights, but only a brief skirmish ensued. Then, on September 13th, 2 Confederate brigades arrived and easily drove the Union troops from the Heights, but the critical positions to the west and south of town remained heavily defended. By September 14th, Jackson had methodically positioned his artillery around Harper's Ferry, and ordered Major General A.P. Hill to move down the west bank of the Shenandoah River in preparation for a flank attack on the Union left the next morning. By the following morning, Jackson had positioned nearly 50 guns on Maryland Heights and at the base of Loudon Heights. Then he began a fierce artillery barrage from all sides, followed by a full-out infantry assault. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, Colonel Miles raised the white flag of surrender. The Battle of Antietam. Eventually, the Confederates figured out where McClellan was, and to Lee's great surprise, McClellan's army began moving at an uncharacteristically quick pace, pushing in on his Confederate forces at several mountain passes at South Mountain, including at Turner's Gap and Crampton's Gap. While Jackson's wing was forcing the Harper's Ferry garrison to surrender, Lee regathered his other scattered units around Sharpsburg near Antietam Creek. McClellan's army, which may have outnumbered Lee's forces by about 50,000 men, confronted the Confederates around the night of September 16th. Longstreet described the scene before the battle commenced. The blue uniforms of the Federals appeared among the trees that crowned the heights on the eastern bank of the Antietam. The number increased, and larger grew the field of blue until it seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see, and from the tops of the mountains down to the edge of the stream gathered the great army of McClellan. As fate would have it, the bloodiest day in the history of the United States took place on the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. On September 17, 1862, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fought McClellan's Army of the Potomac outside Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. That day, nearly 25,000 would become casualties, and Lee's army barely suffered fighting the much bigger Northern Army. The fighting that morning started with savage fighting on the Confederate left flank near Dunker Church, in a cornfield and forest. The Confederates barely held the field in the north sector, and might not have but for the injury of one Corps Commander Joe Hooker, which helped cause the Union's attack to fizzle. During the late morning and early afternoon, Hancock's men were engaged in the center of the line near a sunken road that would become forever known as Bloody Lane. Following the mortal wounding of Union Major General Israel B. Richardson at about 1 o'clock p.m., as the fighting flared across Bloody Lane, Brigadier General Hancock was ordered to assume temporary command of the 1st Division of the two corps. Making a grand and dramatic entrance onto the battlefield, Hancock galloped between his troops and the enemy along Bloody Lane, obviously prepared for battle. Knowing how aggressive their general was, Hancock's men braced themselves to mount a counterattack against the exhausted Confederates. To their surprise, however, Commanding Officer General McClellan instead ordered Hancock and his men to maintain their position. Lee's army may have been saved by the Northern Army's inability to cross the creek near Burnside's Bridge. Ambrose Burnside had been given command of the right wing of the Army of the Potomac, the 1 Corps and 9 Corps, at the start of the Maryland campaign for the Battle of South Mountain. But McClellan separated the two corps at the Battle of Antietam, placing them on opposite ends of the Union battle line. However, Burnside continued to act as though he was a wing commander instead of a corps commander. So instead of ordering the 9 Corps, he funneled orders through General Jacob D. Cox. This poor organization contributed to the Corps' hours-long delay in attacking and crossing what is now called Burnside's Bridge on the right flank of the Confederate line. Making matters worse, Burnside did not perform adequate reconnaissance of the area, which afforded several easy fording sites of the creek out of range of the Army of Northern Virginia. Instead of unopposed crossings, his troops were forced into repeated assaults across the narrow bridge, which was dominated by Confederate sharpshooters on high ground across the bridge. The delay allowed General A.P. Hill's Confederate division to reach the battlefield from Harper's Ferry in time to save Lee's right flank that afternoon. By the end of the afternoon, Union attacks on the flanks and the center of the line had been violent but eventually unsuccessful. Fearing that his army was badly bloodied and figuring Lee had many more men than he did, McClellan refused to commit his reserves to continue the attacks, unnerved by Fitz John Porter telling him, "Remember, General, I command the last reserve of the last army of the Republic." Thus, the day ended in a tactical stalemate. After the battle, McClellan wrote to his wife, "Those in whose judgment I rely tell me that I fought the battle splendidly and that it was a masterpiece of art. I feel I have done all that can be asked in twice saving the country. I feel some little pride in having, with a beaten and demoralized army, defeated Lee so utterly. Well, one of these days history will, I trust, do me justice." Historians have generally been far less kind with their praise, criticizing McClellan for not sharing his battle plans with his corps commanders, which prevented them from using initiative outside of their sectors. McClellan also failed to use cavalry in the battle. Had cavalry been used for reconnaissance, other fording options might have prevented the debacle at Burnside's bridge. On the morning of September 18th, Lee's army prepared to defend against a Union assault that ultimately never came. Finally, an improvised truce was declared to allow both sides to exchange their wounded. That evening, Lee's forces began withdrawing across the Potomac to return to Virginia. Though McClellan did try to strike at Lee, most notably at Shepherdstown, Lee's rear guard was formidable enough that officers throughout the Army of the Potomac concurred with McClellan's actions. Lee's army then moved toward the Shenandoah Valley, while the Army of the Potomac hovered around Sharpsburg. Nevertheless, Antietam is now widely considered a turning point in the war. Although the battle was tactically a draw, it resulted in forcing Lee's army out of Maryland and back into Virginia, making it a strategic victory for the North and an opportune time for President Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Chapter 11. The Fredericksburg Campaign. Despite heavily outnumbering the Southern Army and badly damaging it during the Battle of Antietam, McClellan decided not to pursue Lee across the Potomac, citing shortages of equipment and the fear of overextending his forces. General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck wrote in his official report, "The long inactivity of so large an army in the face of a defeated foe, and during the most favorable season for rapid movements and a vigorous campaign, was a matter of great disappointment and regret." Lincoln had also had enough of McClellan's constant excuses for not taking forward action, and he relieved McClellan of his command of the Army of the Potomac on November 7th, effectively ending the general's military career. In place of McClellan, Lincoln appointed Burnside, who had just failed at Antietam. Burnside didn't believe he was competent to command the entire army, a very honest and accurate judgment. However, Burnside also didn't want the command to fall upon Joe Hooker, who had been injured while aggressively fighting with his 1 Corps at Antietam in the morning. Thus, he accepted. Burnside wasn't the only one receiving a promotion during the Fredericksburg Campaign. On November 29, 1862, Hancock was promoted to Major General of Volunteers and was elevated to command of a division. Under pressure from Lincoln to be aggressive, Burnside laid out a difficult plan to cross the Rappahannock and attack the Confederates near Fredericksburg. The plan was doomed from the very beginning. On December 12th, Burnside's army struggled to cross the river under fire from Confederate sharpshooters in the town. In the first fighting on December 13th, the Army of the Potomac could not dislodge Stonewall Jackson's men on the right flank, but the battle is mostly remembered, however, for the piecemeal attacks the Union Army made on heavily fortified positions Longstreet's men took up on Mary's Heights. With the massacre at Antietam still fresh in his mind, partially caused by the Confederates having not constructed defensive works, Longstreet ordered trenches, abatis, obstacles formed by felled trees with sharpened branches, and field works to be constructed, which, to Longstreet's credit, set a precedent for all future defensive battles in the Eastern Theater. In addition to the artillery positions, 2,500 Confederates lined up 4 deep behind a quarter-mile-long 4-foot stone wall that would deter even the most foolhardy. Thus, when it was learned that General Burnside was planning a direct assault on the Heights, even the other Union generals couldn't believe it. Unfortunately for Hancock and his men, Hancock's division was one of the ones ordered to make the desperate attack in support of General French's division. Making matters worse, Hancock had to send his brigades in individually, instead of in one concerted attack as a division. Hancock first sent Zook's brigade, which was almost immediately repulsed as it followed on the heels of one of the brigades of French's division. Hancock then sent in the famed Irish Brigade, which by chance was attacking positions held by fellow Irishmen in the 24th Georgia Infantry. One Confederate who spotted the Irish Brigade's green regimental flags coming on yelled, "Oh God, what a pity! Here comes Meagher's fellows." Hancock's final brigade was led by Brigadier General John C. Caldwell. Like the others, that brigade marched in formation, got within firing range, fired, stopped to reload, and then continued the assault. In other words, they were sitting ducks. At one point during the carnage, when Lee saw yet another assault massing, he expressed concern to Longstreet, to which Longstreet replied, "General, if you put every man on the other side of the Potomac on that field to approach me over the same line, and give me plenty of ammunition, I will kill them all before they reach my line." As they threw themselves at Longstreet's heavily fortified position along the high ground, the Northern soldiers were mowed down again and again. General Longstreet compared the near-continuous fall of soldiers on the battlefield to the steady dripping of rain from the eaves of a house. Still, Burnside sent wave after wave up the hill, with the Union injured, or those just cowering in the field, trying to stop the advancing men by grabbing at their legs and feet, begging them to turn back. In the end, a recorded 14 assaults were made on Mary's heights, all of which failed, with over 12,650 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or missing during the battle. Hancock himself suffered a wound in the abdomen. Despite all their efforts, not one Union soldier got within 100 feet of the wall at Mary's Heights before being shot or forced to withdraw. As men lay dying on the field that night, the Northern Lights made a rare appearance. Southern soldiers took it as a divine omen and wrote about it frequently in their diaries. The Union soldiers saw less divine inspiration in the Northern Lights and mentioned it less in their own. The Battle of Fredericksburg also spawned one of Lee's most memorable quotes. During the battle, Lee turned to Longstreet and commented, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we would grow too fond of it." Though Fredericksburg was clearly a Union disaster, Hancock was noted for his valor. In turn, Hancock noted the valor of his own men, writing in his official report after the battle. Colonel Zook's brigade was the first in order. As soon as it had formed line, it advanced to the attack with spirit, passing the point at which the preceding troops had arrived, and being joined as it passed by the brave regiments of the Kimball's brigade and some other regiments of French's division. It failed, however, to take the stone wall, behind which the enemy was posted, although our dead were left within 25 paces of it. These troops still held their line of battle in front of the enemy and within close musketry range. The Irish brigade next advanced to the assault. The same gallantry was displayed, but with the same results. Caldwell's brigade was next ordered into action, and although it behaved with the utmost valor, failed to carry the enemy's position. All the troops then formed one line of battle, extending from a point a little distance to the right of Hanover Street, in a line nearly parallel to the enemy, with the left thrown back, the extreme left extending about the front of two regiments to the left of the railroad culvert. This line was held during the entire day, and until it was relieved, some of the regiments not coming out the field until 10 o'clock the following morning. This line was held for hours after the troops had exhausted their ammunition, and after the ammunition of the killed and wounded within reach had been expended. Shortly after the last of my brigades came into action, it appeared as if the front crest of the enemy's hill might have been taken had there been other troops at hand, for the enemy were at that time running from their rifle pits and works on the crest directly in front of our right. But by the time Howard's troops were ready to attack, the enemy had repaired this, and making a strong attack at the same time toward our left, it became necessary that a portion of that division should be detached toward that flank. After this hour it appeared to me, although reports were occasionally received that we were gaining ground, which led us to hope it might prove true, that, our object having failed, the only thing to be done was to maintain our front line by constantly supporting it until darkness covered the scene. The bravery and devotion of the troops could not have been surpassed, as an evidence of which it is but necessary to mention the losses incurred. Out of 5,006 men, the maximum taken into action by me, the loss was 2,013 men, of whom 156 were commissioned officers. It will be observed that the losses in some of the regiments were of unusual severity, such as is seldom seen in any battle, no matter how prolonged. These were veteran regiments, led by able and tried commanders, and I regret to say that their places cannot soon be filled. Although the division failed to carry the enemy's heights, it lost no honor, but held the ground it took, and, under the most discouraging obstacles, retained it until relieved after the action was over. It will be impossible to mention in this report the names of all those who were distinguished. Chapter 12. The Chancellorsville Campaign. Lee had concluded an incredibly successful year for the Confederates in the East, but the South was still struggling. The Confederate forces in the West had failed to win a major battle, suffering defeat at places like Shiloh in Tennessee and across the Mississippi River. As the war continued into 1863, the Southern economy continued to deteriorate. Southern armies were suffering serious deficiencies of nearly all supplies as the Union blockade continued to be effective at stopping most international commerce with the Confederacy. Moreover, the prospect of Great Britain or France recognizing the Confederacy had been all but eliminated by the Emancipation Proclamation. Given the unlikelihood of forcing the North's capitulation, the Confederacy's main hope for victory was to win some decisive victory, or hope that Abraham Lincoln would lose his re-election bid in 1864, and that the new president would want to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. Understandably, this colored Confederate war strategy, and unquestionably Lee's. After the Fredericksburg debacle and the Mud March fiasco that left a Union advance literally dead in its tracks, Lincoln fired Burnside and replaced him with Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker had gotten his nickname from a clerical error in a newspaper's description of fighting, but the nickname stuck, and Lee would later playfully refer to him as F.J. Hooker. Hooker had stood out for his zealous fighting at Antietam, and the battle may very well have turned out differently if he hadn't been injured at the head of the One Corps. Now he was in command of a 100,000-man Army of the Potomac, and he devised a complex plan to cross the Rappahannock River with part of his force near Fredericksburg to pin down Lee while using the other bulk to turn Lee's left, which would allow his forces to reach the Confederate rear. Hooker's plan initially worked perfectly, with a division of his army surprising Lee. Lee was outnumbered 2-1 and now had to worry about threats on two fronts. Incredibly, Lee once again decided to divide his forces in the face of the enemy, sending Stonewall Jackson to turn the Union Army's right flank while the rest of the army maintained positions near Fredericksburg. The Battle of Chancellorsville is one of the most famous of the Civil War, and the most famous part of the battle was Stonewall Jackson's daring march across the Army of the Potomac's flank, surprising the 11th Corps with an attack on May 2, 1863. Having ignored warnings of Jackson's march, the 11th Corps was quickly routed. The surprise was a costly success, however. Jackson scattered out ahead of his lines later that night and was mistakenly fired upon by his own men, badly wounding him. Jackson's natural replacement, A.P. Hill, was also injured, so Lee had cavalry leader J.E.B. Stuart assume command of Jackson's corps with Jackson out of action. On May 3rd, Stuart fiercely attacked the Union Army, attempting to push them into the river, while on the other flank, the Confederates evacuated from Fredericksburg but ultimately held the line. Hooker began to lose his nerve, and he was injured during the battle when a cannonball nearly killed him. Historians now believe that Hooker may have commanded part of the battle while suffering from a concussion. During Jackson's and Stuart's assaults, Hancock's division, as part of the II Corps, continued to comprise the center of Hooker's line, and they faced only nominal fighting in their sector. But with Hooker being injured and his men facing desperate assaults on his right flank, he lost his nerve, and he became determined to withdraw his army back across the Rappahannock River after the fighting on May 3rd and 4th. From May 5th to 6th, Hooker began the delicate process of withdrawing his army, and it was at this point that Hancock and his division were being called upon. With men of the II Corps covering the evacuation, Hooker and the artillery crossed first, followed by the infantry on the morning of May 6th. However, rains caused the river to rise and threatened to break the pontoon bridges, nearly leaving Hancock and the II Corps separated on the south side of the river after Hooker departed. II Corps Commander Couch had been ordered not to continue the battle, but many men in the Army of the Potomac had wanted to keep fighting, and Couch was tempted to actually stay and fight. During the withdrawal, Hancock was wounded yet again. Chancellorsville was one of the most stunning battles of the Civil War, and not surprisingly, there were some serious shakeups in its aftermath as generals pointed the fingers at each other. Hooker had a list of scapegoats, including 11th Corps Commander Oliver O. Howard, Cavalry Leader George Stoneman, and General Sedgwick of the 6th Corps. Of course, just as many blamed Hooker, including II Corps Commander Darius N. Couch, who was so disgusted with Hooker's battle performance that he subsequently transferred out of the Army of the Potomac in protest and headed back to Pennsylvania to lead the state militia. This left Hancock as the new commander of the II Corps. Hancock, however, was unaware that General Hooker had a special plan for the 2nd Corps. Unbeknownst to Hancock at this time, in Hooker's desire to draw General Lee out into the open and away from his entrenchments, Hooker began intentionally isolating Hancock's corps away from the rest of the Union Army whenever possible. Having taken an assessment of Lee's troop strength and commanding style, Hooker had become convinced that it would be difficult, virtually impossible, to force Lee to take the offensive unless good opportunity were offered. Thus, he planned to use Hancock's II Corps as bait. Considering the distance Lee would have to move his troops to attack the isolated Hancock, Hooker figured he couldn't do so with more than a small complement, and he was certain that Hancock could whip a portion of the Confederate Army under Lee's command. As long as Hooker maintained close communication, he could bring up reinforcements at least as rapidly as the enemy, thus increasing his chances of forcing Lee into an open field confrontation. By May 22, 1863, Lee had still not taken the bait. As the North was about to discover, Lee had a completely different plan in mind. Chapter 13. The Pennsylvania Campaign. Knowing that victories on Virginia soil meant little to an enemy that could simply retreat, regroup, and then return with more men and more advanced equipment, Lee set his sights on a northern invasion, aiming to turn northern opinion against the war and against President Lincoln. Given the right circumstances, Lee's army might even be able to capture either Baltimore or Philadelphia and use the city as leverage in peace negotiations. In the wake of Jackson's death, Lee reorganized his army, creating 3 corps out of the previous 2, with A.P. Hill and Richard S. Ewell replacing Stonewall. Hill had been a successful division commander, but he was constantly battling bouts of sickness that left him disabled, which would occur at Gettysburg. Ewell had distinguished himself during the Peninsula Campaign, suffering a serious injury that historians often credit as making him more cautious in command upon his return. With J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry screening his movements, Lee marched his army into Pennsylvania, once again dividing his forces to take different objectives. This time, however, they mostly stayed within a day's marching distance of each other. Meanwhile, the loss at Chancellorsville led to Lincoln relieving Hooker as he was leading the Army of the Potomac in pursuit of Lee. George Meade assumed command of the Army of the Potomac just a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg. Stuart established a reputation as an audacious cavalry commander, and on 2 occasions, during the Peninsula Campaign and the Maryland Campaign, rode around the Army of the Potomac in its rear, bringing fame to himself and embarrassment to the Union generals, especially General McClellan. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, he distinguished himself as a temporary commander of the wounded Stonewall Jackson's infantry corps. However, Stuart's role at Gettysburg was far more controversial. Given great discretion in his cavalry operations before the battle, Stuart's cavalry was too far removed from the Army of Northern Virginia to warn Lee of the Army of the Potomac's movements. As it would turn out, Lee's army inadvertently stumbled into Union cavalry and then the Union Army at Gettysburg on the morning of July 1, 1863, walking blindly into what became the largest battle of the war. Stuart has been heavily criticized ever since, and it is said Lee took him to task when he arrived on the 2nd day, leading Stuart to offer his resignation. Lee didn't accept it, but he would later note in his after-battle report that the cavalry had not updated him as to the Army of the Potomac's movements. It is believed that one of the first notices Lee got about the Army of the Potomac's movements came from a spy named Harrison, a man who apparently worked undercover for Longstreet, but of whom little is known. Harrison reported that General George G. Meade was now in command of the Union Army, and was at that very moment marching north to meet Lee's army. July 1, 1863. Without question, the most famous battle of the Civil War took place outside of the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which happened to be a transportation hub, serving as the center of a wheel with several roads leading out to other Pennsylvanian towns. Lee was unaware of Meade's position when an advance division of Hill's corps marched toward Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st. The battle began with John Buford's Union cavalry forces skirmishing against the advancing division of Hess just outside of town. Buford's actions allowed the 1 Corps of the Army of the Potomac to reach Gettysburg and engage the Confederates, eventually setting the stage for the biggest and most well-known battle of the war. The 1 Corps was led by Pennsylvania General John F. Reynolds, an effective general that had been considered for command of the entire army in place of Hooker, and was considered by many the best general in the army. Since Lee had invaded Pennsylvania, many believe that Reynolds was even more active and aggressive than he might have otherwise been, and as he was at the front positioning his men, he was shot and killed. With his death, command of the 1 Corps fell upon Major General Abner Doubleday, the Civil War veteran wrongly credited for inventing baseball. Meanwhile, General Oliver O. Howard and his 11 Corps came up on the right of the 1 Corps, eager to replace the stain the 11 Corps had suffered at Chancellorsville thanks to Stonewall Jackson. As a general battle began to form northwest of town, news was making its way back to Meade several miles away that Reynolds had been killed, and that a battle was developing. Meade had been drawing up a proposed defensive line several miles away from Gettysburg near Emmitsburg, Maryland. But when news of the morning's fighting reached him, Meade sent Hancock ahead to take command in the field, putting him in temporary command of the left wing of the army consisting of the 1, 2, 3, and 11 Corps. Meade also charged Hancock with determining whether to fight the general battle near Gettysburg or to pull back to the line Meade had been drawing up. Hancock would not be the senior officer on the field, Howard outranked him, so the fact that he was ordered to take command of the field demonstrates how much Meade trusted him. As Hancock headed toward the fighting, and while the Army of the Potomac's 1 and 11 Corps engaged in heavy fighting, they were eventually flanked from the north by Ewell's Confederate Corps, which was returning toward Gettysburg from its previous objective. After a disorderly retreat through the town itself, the Union men began to dig in on high ground to the southeast of the town. When Hancock met up with Howard, he told the 11 Corps commander, I think this the strongest position by nature upon which to fight a battle that I ever saw." When Howard agreed, Hancock replied, "Very well, sir. I select this as the battlefield." As the Confederates sent the Union Corps retreating, Lee arrived on the field and saw the importance of the defensive positions the Union men were taking up along Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Late in the afternoon, Lee sent discretionary orders to Ewell that Cemetery Hill be taken if practicable. But ultimately Ewell chose not to attempt the assault. Lee's order has been criticized because it left too much discretion to Ewell, leaving historians to speculate on how the more aggressive Stonewall Jackson would have acted on this order if he had lived to command this wing of Lee's army, and how differently the second day of battle would have proceeded with Confederate possession of Culp's Hill or Cemetery Hill. Discretionary orders were customary for General Lee because Jackson and Longstreet, his other principal subordinates, usually reacted to them aggressively and used their initiative to act quickly and forcefully. Ewell's decision not to attack, whether justified or not, may have ultimately cost the Confederates the battle. With so many men engaged and now taking refuge on the high ground, Meade, who was an engineer like Lee, abandoned his previous plan to draw up a defensive line around Emmitsburg a few miles to the south. After a council of war, the Army of the Potomac decided to defend at Gettysburg. Day 1 by itself would have been one of the 20 biggest battles of the Civil War, and it was a tactical Confederate victory. Hancock's decision-making was instrumental in determining that the battle would continue there, and few would be as instrumental in deciding the outcome. July 2nd, 1863. On the morning of July 2nd, Meade was determined to make a stand at Gettysburg, and Lee was determined to strike at it. That morning, Lee decided to make strong attacks on both Union flanks while feigning in the middle, ordering Ewell's corps to attack Culp's Hill on the Union right, while Longstreet's corps would attack on the Union left. As it turned out, both attacks would come too late. Though there was a controversy over when Lee ordered Longstreet's attack, Longstreet's march got tangled up and caused several hours of delay. Lost cause advocates attacking Longstreet would later claim his attack was supposed to take place as early as possible, although no official Confederate orders gave a time for the attack. Lee gave the order for the attack around 11 o'clock a.m., and it was known that Longstreet was reluctant about making it. He still wanted to slide around the Union flank, interpose the Confederate Army between Washington, D.C. and the Army of the Potomac, and force Meade to attack them. Between Longstreet's delays and the mix-up in the march that forced parts of his corps to double back and make a winding march, Longstreet's men weren't ready to attack until about 4 o'clock p.m. Longstreet's biographer, Jeffrey Wirt, wrote, "Longstreet deserves censure for his performance on the morning of July 2nd. He allowed his disagreement with Lee's decision to affect his conduct. Once the commanding general determined to assail the enemy, duty required Longstreet to comply with the vigor and thoroughness that had previously characterized his generalship. The concern for detail, the regard for timely information, and the need for preparation were absent." Edwin Cottington, whose history of the Gettysburg campaign still continues to be considered the best ever written, described Longstreet's march as a comedy of errors such as one might expect of inexperienced commanders and raw militia, but not of Lee's war horse and his veteran troops. Cottington considered it a dark moment in Longstreet's career as a general. Writing about Day 2, Longstreet criticized Lee, insisting once again that the right move was to move around the Union flank. "The opportunity for our right was in the air. General Halleck saw it from Washington. General Meade saw it and was apprehensive of it. Even General Pendleton refers to it in favorable mention in his official report. Failing to adopt it, General Lee should have gone with us to his right. He had seen and carefully examined the left of his line, and only gave us a guide to show the way to the right, leaving the battle to be adjusted to formidable and difficult grounds without his assistance. If he had been with us, General Hood's messengers could have been referred to General Headquarters, but to delay and send messengers 5 miles in favor of a move that he had rejected would have been contumacious. The opportunity was with the Confederates from the assembling on Cemetery Hill. It was inviting of their preconceived plans. It was the object of and excuse for the invasion as a substitute for more direct efforts for the relief of Vicksburg. Confederate writers and talkers claim that General Meade could have escaped without making aggressive battle, but that is equivalent to confession of the inertia that failed to grasp the opportunity. With General George Meade once again in command, Hancock and the II Corps was positioned on Cemetery Ridge, roughly in the center of the Union line. Since Lee intended to strike at both Union flanks, theoretically Hancock's men should very well not have been engaged at all on the second day of the battle. Instead, Hancock and his corps wound up playing a crucial role in the fighting on July 2, 1863. Thanks primarily to Three Corps Commander Dan Sickles, who had moved his entire corps forward nearly a mile against Meade's orders. It has been speculated by some historians that Sickles moved forward to occupy high ground in his front due to the devastation unleashed against the Three Corps at Chancellorsville once Confederates took high ground and operated their artillery on Hazel Grove. Sickles and Meade would feud over the actions on Day 2 in the years after the war, after Sickles, who lost a leg that day, took credit for the victory by disrupting Lee's attack plans. Historians have almost universally sided with Meade, pointing out that Sickles nearly had his Three Corps annihilated during Longstreet's attack. As a result of the fact Sickles had moved his men so far out of position, it created a major gap in the Union line and brought the Three Corps directly into Longstreet's path. Longstreet's assault commenced by smashing into Sickles' Three Corps, engaging them in a peach orchard, wheat field, and Devil's Den, an outcropping of boulders that provided the Confederates prime cover. When it became obvious that Sickles' Three Corps was in dire straits, the chaos in that sector acted like a vacuum that induced both sides to pour more men into the vicinity. Moreover, when Sickles was injured, command of the Three Corps fell upon Hancock as well. Realizing what was happening, Hancock sent in his 2-Corps 1st Division, under Brigadier General John C. Caldwell, to reinforce the Three Corps in the wheat field. The fighting in the wheat field was so intense that Caldwell's division would be all but annihilated during the afternoon. At the same time, men from Confederate General A.P. Hill's corps made their advance toward the Union center, forcing Hancock to rally defenses and rushed units to critical spots to patch the holes. With Hill in his front and Longstreet's attack to his left, Hancock was in the unenviable position of having to attempt to resist Confederate advances spread out over a few miles, at least until more and more reserves could be rushed over from the other side of the Union line to the Army's left flank. Hancock made one of the most critical decisions of his military career. Ordering his men to make what was essentially a suicidal bayonet charge into the face of Hill's Confederates on Cemetery Ridge, Hancock sent the 1st Minnesota to charge a Confederate brigade 4 times its size. One of the Minnesota volunteers, one William Loughran, later said, "Every man realized in an instant what the order meant, death or wounds to us all, the sacrifice of the regiment to gain a few minutes' time and save the position, and probably the battlefield, and every man saw and accepted the necessity of the sacrifice." While extremely costly to the regiment, the Minnesotans suffered 87% casualties, the worst of any regiment at Gettysburg. This heroic sacrifice bought time to organize the defensive line and kept the battle from turning in favor of the Confederates. Hancock would write of them, "I cannot speak too highly of this regiment and its commander in its attack, as well as in its subsequent advance against the enemy, in which it lost 3/4 of the officers and men engaged." As Longstreet's assault on the Union left continued, his line naturally got more and more entangled as well. As Longstreet's men kept moving to the right, they reached the base of Little Round Top and Round Top, 2 rocky hills south of Gettysburg proper, at the far left. When Meade's chief engineer, Brigadier General Governor Warren, spotted the sun shining up the bayonets of Longstreet's men as they moved toward the Union left, it alerted the Army of the Potomac of the need to occupy Little Round Top, high ground that commanded much of the field. The men who moved into position came in the form of Strong Vincent's brigade. In front of Vincent's brigade was General Evander Law's advancing Alabama brigade, of Hood's division. Law ordered 5 regiments to take Little Round Top, the 4th, 15th, and 47th Alabama, and the 4th and 5th Texas, but they had already marched more than 20 miles just to reach that point. They were now being asked to charge up high ground on a muggy, hot day. Nevertheless, the Confederates made desperate assaults against Little Round Top, even after being repulsed by the Union defenders several times. In the middle of the fighting, after he saw Confederates trying to push around his flank, Chamberlain stretched his line until his regiment was merely a single-file line, and he then had to order his left, southernmost half to swing back, thus forming an angle in their line in an effort to prevent a flank attack. Despite suffering heavy losses, the 20th Maine held through 2 subsequent charges by the 15th Alabama and other Confederate regiments for nearly 2 hours. Even after repulsing the Confederates several times, Chamberlain and his regiment faced a serious dilemma. With casualties mounting and ammunition running low, in desperation, Chamberlain claimed to have ordered his left wing to initiate an all-out pivoting bayonet charge. With the 20th Maine charging ahead, the left wing wheeling continually to make the charging line swing like a hinge, thus creating a simultaneous frontal assault and flanking maneuver, they ultimately succeeded in not only taking the hill, but capturing 100 Confederate soldiers in the process. Chamberlain suffered 2 slight wounds in the battle, one when a shot ricocheted off his sword scabbard and bruised his thigh, another when his right foot was struck by a piece of shrapnel. With this success, Chamberlain was credited with preventing the Union flank from being penetrated and keeping the Confederates from pouring in behind Union lines. Ultimately, it was the occupation and defense of Little Round Top that saved the rest of the Union line at Gettysburg. Had the Confederates commanded that high ground, it would have been able to position artillery that could have swept the Union lines along Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, which would have certainly forced the Army of the Potomac to withdraw from their lines. Chamberlain would be awarded the coveted Congressional Medal of Honor for daring heroism and great tenacity in holding his position on the Little Round Top against repeated assaults and carrying the advanced position on the Great Round Top. And the 20th Maine's actions that day became one of the most famous attacks of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War as a whole. While the Army of the Potomac managed to desperately hold on the left, Ewell's attack against Culp's Hill on the other end of the field met with some success in pushing the Army of the Potomac back. However, the attack started so late in the day that nightfall made it impossible for the Confederates to capitalize on their success. Ewell's men would spend the night at the base of Culp's Hill and partially up the hill, but it would fall upon them to pick up the attack the next morning. That night, Meade held another council of war. Having been attacked on both flanks, Meade and his top officers correctly surmised that Lee would attempt an attack on the center of the line the next day. Moreover, captured Confederates and the fighting and intelligence of Day 2 let it be known that the only Confederate unit that had not yet seen action during the fighting was George Pickett's division of Longstreet's corps. July 3, 1863. July 3, 1863, Day 3 of the Battle of Gettysburg, was the most important day for several Civil War generals' careers, as well as their legacies. Winfield Scott Hancock would be one of them. Longstreet did not meet with Lee on the night of July 2nd, so when Lee met with him the following morning, he found Longstreet's men were not ready to conduct an early morning attack, which Lee had wanted to attempt just as he was on the other side of the lines against Culp's Hill. With Pickett's men not up, however, Longstreet's corps couldn't make such an attack. Lee later wrote that Longstreet's dispositions were not completed as early as was expected. On the morning of July 3rd, the Confederate attack against Culp's Hill fizzled out, but by then, Lee had already planned a massive attack on the Union center, combined with having Stuart's cavalry attack the Union Army's lines in the rear. A successful attack would split the Army of the Potomac at the same time its communication and supply lines were severed by Stuart, which would make it possible to capture the entire army in detail. There was just one problem with the plan, as Longstreet told Lee that morning. No 15,000 men who ever existed could successfully execute the attack. The charge required marching across an open field for about a mile, with the Union artillery holding high ground on all sides of the incoming Confederates. Longstreet ardently opposed the attack, but, already 2 days into the battle, Lee explained that because the Army of the Potomac was here on the field, he must strike at it. Longstreet later wrote that he said, "General Lee, I have been a soldier all my life. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Longstreet proposed instead that their men should slip around the Union forces and occupy the high ground, forcing Northern commanders to attack them rather than vice versa. Realizing the insanity of sending 15,000 men hurtling into all the Union artillery, Lee planned to use the Confederate artillery to try to knock out the Union artillery ahead of time. Although old friend William Pendleton was the artillery chief, the artillery cannonade would be supervised by Edward Porter Alexander, Longstreet's chief artillerist, who would have to give the go-ahead to the charging infantry because they were falling under Longstreet's command. Alexander later noted that Longstreet was so disturbed and dejected about ordering the attack that at one point he tried to make Alexander order the infantry forward, essentially doing Longstreet's dirty work for him. As Longstreet had predicted, from the beginning the plan was an abject failure. Stuart's men did not defeat the Union cavalry and thus had no success. Just after 1:00 p.m., 150 Confederate guns began to fire from Cemetery Ridge, hoping to incapacitate the Union center before launching an infantry attack. But they mostly overshot their mark. The artillery duel could be heard from dozens of miles away, and all the smoke led to Confederate artillery constantly overshooting their targets. Realizing that the artillery was meant for them as a way of softening them up for an infantry charge, Hancock calmly rode his horse up and down the line of the two corps, both inspiring and assuring his men with his own courage and resolve. During the massive Confederate artillery bombardment that preceded the infantry assault, Hancock was so conspicuous on horseback reviewing and encouraging his troops that one of his subordinates pleaded with him that the corps commander ought not to risk his life that way. Hancock reportedly replied, "There are times when a corps commander's life does not count." Eventually, Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt cleverly figured that if the Union cannon stopped firing back, the Confederates might think they successfully knocked out the Union batteries. On top of that, the Union would be preserving its ammunition for the impending charge that everyone now knew was coming. When they stopped, Lee, Alexander, and others mistakenly concluded that they'd knocked out the Union artillery. A short time later, Confederate General George Pickett, commander of one of the 3 divisions under General Longstreet, prepared for the charge that would forever bear his name, even though he commanded only about a third of the force and was officially under Longstreet's direction. With his men in position, Pickett asked Longstreet to give the order to advance, but Longstreet could only nod, fearing that to verbalize the order may reveal his utter lack of competence in the plan. Thus, about 15,000 Confederates stepped out in sight and began their charge with an orderly march starting about a mile away. No doubt an inspiring sight to Hancock and the Union men directly across from the oncoming assault. As the Confederate line advanced, Union cannon on Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top began blasting away, with Confederate soldiers continuing to march forward. One Union soldier later wrote, "We could not help hitting them with every shot. A dozen men might be felled by one single bursting shell." By the time Longstreet's men reached Emmitsburg Road, Union artillery switched to firing grape shot, tin cans filled with iron and lead balls, and as the Confederate troops continued to approach the Union center, Union troops positioned behind the wall cut down the oncoming Confederates, easily decimating both flanks. And while some of the men did manage to advance to the Union line and engage in hand-to-hand combat, it was of little consequence. In the midst of the fighting, as he was conferring with one of his brigadier generals, General Stannard, Hancock suddenly felt a searing pain in his thigh. He had just been severely wounded when a bullet struck the pommel of his saddle and entered his inner right thigh, along with wood splinters and a large bent nail. Helped from his horse by his aides, he removed the saddle nail himself and applied a tourniquet, colorfully swearing at his own men while demanding that they not let him bleed to death. Nevertheless, he refused to remove himself to the rear until the offensive had concluded. After about an hour, nearly 6,500 Confederates were dead or wounded, 5 times that of the Union, with all 13 regimental commanders in Pickett's division killed or wounded. In the aftermath of the defeat, General Longstreet stated, "General Lee came up as our troops were falling back and encouraged them as well as he could, begged them to reform their ranks and reorganize their forces. And it was then he used the expression, 'It was all my fault. Get together and let us do the best we can toward saving which is left to us.'" Longstreet never resisted an opportunity to distance himself from failure and direct it toward someone else, even Lee. Today, Pickett's charge is remembered as the American version of the Charge of the Light Brigade, a heroic but completely futile march that had no chance of success. In fact, it's remembered as Pickett's charge because Pickett's Virginians wanted to claim the glory of getting the furthest during the attack in the years after the war. The charge consisted of about 15,000 men under the command of James Longstreet, with 3 divisions spearheaded by Pickett, Trimble, and Pettigrew. Trimble and Pettigrew were leading men from A.P. Hill's corps, and Hill was too disabled by illness that day to choose the men from his corps to make the charge. As a result, some of the men who charged that day had already engaged in heavy fighting. The charge suffered about a 50% casualty rate, as the Confederates marched into hell. The men barely made a dent in the Union line before retreating in disorder back across the field, where Lee met them in an effort to regroup them in case the Union counterattacked. At one point, Lee ordered Pickett to reform his division, to which Pickett reportedly cried, "I have no division." One of the Virginians who marched straight into Hancock's 2 Corps was his old friend Lewis A. Armistead, who was leading one of Pickett's brigades. Armistead famously led his brigade with his hat atop his sword, serving as a visual cue for his men, and they actually breached the 2 Corps' line, making it about as far as any Confederate got. In the fighting, Armistead was mortally wounded and captured, dying days later. Hancock was unquestionably one of the Union heroes at Gettysburg, if not the greatest hero, but his recognition was slow in coming. In the months after the battle, the U.S. Congress thanked Meade and Howard without listing Hancock. Eventually, Major General Hancock later received the thanks of the U.S. Congress for gallant, meritorious, and conspicuous share in that great and decisive victory. As usual, Hancock shared the credit with his men, writing in his post-battle report. To speak of the conduct of the troops would seem to be unnecessary, but still it may be justly remarked that this corps sustained its well-earned reputation on many fields, and that the boast of its gallant first commander, the late Major General E.B. Sumner, that the Second Corps had never given to the enemy a gun or color, holds good now as it did under the command of my predecessor, Major General Couch. To attest to its good conduct and the perils through which it has passed, it may be stated that its losses in battle have been greater than those of any other corps in the Army of the Potomac, or probably in the service, notwithstanding it has usually been numerically weakest. Chapter 14. The Overland Campaign. Forced out of action for the next 6 months, Hancock performed recruiting duty in Norristown, and though he eventually resumed command, he would suffer the effects of his Gettysburg wound for the duration of his life. By November of 1863, Hancock had started to question his resolve to remain part of the Union war effort. Long past were his superb moments. He'd now been wounded 4 times, his Gettysburg wound stubbornly refused to heal, and independent command seemed no closer than it had several engagements before. There were rumors that General Meade might be relieved of duty, and that he was in line to replace him. But he also began to wonder if his promotions had been more appeasement than acknowledgment of his leadership abilities. Additionally, his once proud II Corps had been reduced to a mere shadow of itself, now bloated with bounty men. Decidedly tired of serving the army and receiving so little glory, he remarked to a colleague, "We do not get any of the credit, considering the fighting we do." Hancock had a good point, especially when he could point to the treatment Meade received in the wake of the battle. Although the Army of the Potomac had been victorious at Gettysburg, Lincoln was still upset at what he perceived to be General Meade's failure to trap Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in Pennsylvania. When Lee retreated from Pennsylvania without much fight from the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln was again discouraged, believing Meade had a chance to end the war if he had been bolder. Though historians dispute that, and the Confederates actually invited attack during the retreat, Lincoln was constantly looking for more aggressive fighters to lead his men. With Lee continuing to hold off the Army of the Potomac in a stalemate along the same battle lines at the end of 1863, Lincoln shook things up. In March 1864, Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all the armies of the United States. His first acts of command were to keep General Halleck in position to serve as a liaison between Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And though it's mostly forgotten today, Grant technically kept General Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac, even though Grant attached himself to that army before the Overland Campaign in 1864, and thus served as its commander for all intents and purposes. In May 1864, with Grant now attached to the Army of the Potomac, the Civil War's 2 most famous generals met each other on the battlefield for the first time. Lee had won stunning victories at battles like Chancellorsville and Second Bull Run by going on the offensive and taking the strategic initiative, but Grant and Lincoln had no intention of letting him do so anymore. Grant ordered General Meade, "Lee's army is your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." By 1864, things were looking so bleak for the South that the Confederate war strategy was simply to ensure Lincoln lost re-election that November, with the hope that a new Democratic president would end the war and recognize the South's independence. With that, and given the shortage in manpower, Lee's strategic objective was to continue defending Richmond, while hoping that Grant would commit some blunder that would allow him a chance to seize an opportunity. On May 4, 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign, crossing the Rapidan River near Fredericksburg with the 100,000-strong Army of the Potomac, which almost doubled Lee's hardened but battered Army in Northern Virginia. It was a similar position to the one George McClellan had in 1862 and Joe Hooker had in 1863, and Grant's first attack, at the Battle of the Wilderness, followed a similar pattern. Nevertheless, Lee proved more than capable on the defensive. From May 5th to 6th, Lee's men won a tactical victory at the Battle of the Wilderness, which was fought so close to where the Battle of Chancellorsville took place a year earlier that soldiers encountered skeletons that had been buried in 2 shallow graves in 1863. Moreover, the woods were so thick that neither side could actually see who they were shooting at, and whole brigades at times got lost in the forest. Still, both armies sustained heavy casualties, while Grant kept attempting to move the fighting to a setting more to his advantage, but the heavy forest made coordinated movements almost impossible. Though ultimately one of the most horrendous battles of the war, where wounded men literally burned to death in fires ignited by rifle fire sparking the underbrush, by the end of the first day, Union forces still held control of vital intersections. That night, Grant ordered General Hancock and his Second Corps to throw everything he had into an assault on the Confederate right at dawn. The next day, as Hancock rode up and down the line establishing order and preparing his men for battle, he was approached by Grant's personal aide, General Horace Porter, who later described the knightly corps commander, writing, "His face was flushed with the excitement of victory. His eyes were lightened by the fire of battle. His flaxen hair was thrust back from his temples. His right arm was extended to its full length and pointing out certain positions. His commanding form towered still higher as he rose in his stirrups to peer through the openings in the woods. It was enough to inspire the troops he led to deeds of unmatched heroism." Clearly, Hancock was poised for a major victory. Hancock's May 6 dawn assault initially went well, successful in driving Confederate forces back to Lee's command post a mile away. By one account, in his wake along the line of his advance, the enemy's dead were everywhere visible. His wounded strewned the road. Prisoners had been captured, and battle flags had been taken. However, he wasn't the only one pressing an assault. Lee was determined to launch an attack in the same sector using Longstreet's corps. Longstreet ordered the advance of 6 brigades by heavy skirmish lines, 4 to flank the Union right and 2 against the front, which allowed his men to deliver continuous fire into the enemy while proving elusive targets themselves. After a confusing exchange of gunfire in a heavily wooded area, Longstreet launched a powerful flanking attack along the Orange Plank Road against Hancock's 2 corps that greatly surprised it and nearly drove it off the field. Almost exactly a year earlier, just miles away from where the Battle of the Wilderness was fought, Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded by fire from his own men. Longstreet nearly suffered the same fate. During the assault, Longstreet was himself wounded, accidentally shot by one of his own men, with the ball passing through the base of his neck and lodging in his shoulder. To assure his men, Longstreet raised his hat as he was being carried off the field, but with Longstreet incapacitated, the momentum of the attack was lost, forcing General Lee to delay further action until units could be realigned. This setback gave Hancock and his corps sufficient time to reorganize, and they were able to hold their position until night fell. By the end of the day, the battle ended at virtually the same place as it had started that morning, except now thousands of men lay dead. Confederate General Edward Porter Alexander later spoke of the loss of Longstreet at the critical juncture of the battle, saying, "I have always believed that, but for Longstreet's fall, the panic which was fairly underway in Hancock's corps would have been extended and have resulted in Grant's being forced to retreat back across the Rapidan." The Confederates had won a tactical victory at a staggering cost, inflicting 17,000 casualties on Grant and suffering 11,000 of their own. Grant disengaged from the battle in the same position as Hooker before him at Chancellorsville, McClellan on the Virginian Peninsula, and Burnside after Fredericksburg. His men got the familiar dreadful feeling that they would retreat back across the Rapidan toward Washington, as they had too many times before. This time, however, Grant made the fateful decision to keep moving south, inspiring his men by telling them that he was prepared to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Using the Union 5 Corps under Major General Governor K. Warren, Grant moved forward in a series of flanking maneuvers that continued to move the Army steadily closer to Richmond. But Lee continued to parry each thrust. The next major battle took place at Spotsylvania Courthouse from May 8th to 21st, with the heaviest fighting on May 12th when a salient in the Confederate line nearly spelled disaster for Lee's army. Under General Grant's direct orders, at 4:30 a.m. on May 12, 1864, Hancock's 2 Corps burst out through the rain and fog, leading a large-scale assault at Spotsylvania Courthouse that caught the Confederates completely by surprise. Breaking through Lee's front line at the Muleshoe with relative ease, Hancock's corps effectively split the Confederate army in half, capturing approximately 20 guns and 2,800 prisoners in the process, the majority of General Jackson's legendary Stonewall Brigade. In their zeal, however, the Union forces lost their cohesion, allowing the Confederates to launch an exuberant counterattack that resulted in savage, unrelenting fighting in the rain-lasting hours, while bodies piled up on both sides. Men were literally trampled under the mud as soldiers advanced to take the place of their fallen comrades. Fighting raged around the bloody angle for hours, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand before the Confederates finally dislodged the Union soldiers. At midnight, the Confederates finally abandoned Muleshoe, but Grant had failed to break Lee's defenses as planned. Cold Harbor. For the next 2 weeks, Grant pursued Lee, sending a number of his commanders to outmaneuver Lee's army, attempting to disrupt Lee's supply lines and threaten his rear, thus forcing him out of the trenches to fight or further retreat. Lee's army continued to stoutly defend against several attacks by the Army of the Potomac, but massive casualties were inflicted on both sides. After Spotsylvania, Grant had already incurred about 35,000 casualties, while inflicting nearly 25,000 casualties on Lee's army. Grant, of course, had the advantage of a steady supply of manpower, so he could afford to fight the war of attrition. It was a fact greatly lost on the people of the North, however, who knew Grant's track record from Shiloh and saw massive casualty numbers during the Overland Campaign. Grant was routinely criticized as a butcher. As fate would have it, the only time during the Overland Campaign Lee had a chance to take the initiative was after Spotsylvania. During the fighting that came to be known as the Battle of North Anna, Lee was heavily debilitated with illness. Grant nearly fell into Lee's trap by splitting his army in two along the North Anna before avoiding it. By the time the two armies reached Cold Harbor near the end of May 1864, Grant incorrectly thought that Lee's army was on the verge of collapse. Though his frontal assaults had failed spectacularly at places like Vicksburg, Grant believed that Lee's army was on the ropes and could be knocked out with a strong attack. The problem was that Lee's men were now masterful at quickly constructing defensive fortifications, including earthworks and trenches that made their positions impregnable. While Civil War generals kept employing Napoleonic tactics, Civil War soldiers were building the types of defensive works that would be the harbinger of World War I's trench warfare. On June 3, 1864, sensing he could break Lee's army, Grant ordered a full-out assault at dawn in the hopes of catching the rebels before they could fully entrench. As fate had it, Hancock's men became part of the vanguard of an attack that would go down in history as one of the bloodiest and costliest failures of the war. Although the story of Union soldiers pinning their names on the back of their uniforms in anticipation of death at Cold Harbor is apocryphal, the frontal assault on June 3rd inflicted thousands of Union casualties in about half an hour. In just minutes, 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded, as 30,000 Confederate soldiers successfully held the line against 50,000 Union troops, losing just 1,500 men in the process. Though credited with a valiant attempt, Hancock's efforts were overshadowed by Grant's horrendous failure and costly bad judgment. With another 12,000 casualties at Cold Harbor, Grant had suffered about as many casualties in a month as Lee had in his entire army at the start of the campaign. Grant later admitted, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained." Hancock wrote in his post-battle account about Cold Harbor, "The first report of casualties after the action, which was unusually short, hardly an hour in duration, showed a loss of 3,024. Among officers, the loss had been without precedent. I had to mourn the loss of those who had hitherto been foremost and most daring and brilliant in action. Among the killed were Colonels McKean, Haskell, and McMahon, already mentioned, three most promising young officers who had never failed to distinguish themselves in battle. Colonel Burns, of the 28th Massachusetts Volunteers, Colonel Porter, of the 8th New York, Colonel Morris, of the 66th New York, all tried and excellent officers. To this list was added, unfortunately, on the following day, Colonel L.O. Morris, 7th New York, killed in the trenches by a sharpshooter. When it is remembered that I had only my two smallest divisions actually engaged, it will be seen that the loss in commanders was unusually severe. It was a blow to the corps from which it did not soon recover." Chapter 15. The Siege of Petersburg. Although Grant's results were widely condemned, he continued to push toward Richmond. After Cold Harbor, Grant managed to successfully steal an entire day's march on Lee and cross the James River, attacking the Confederacy's primary railroad hub at Petersburg, which was only a few miles from Richmond. By the time Lee's army reached Petersburg, it had been defended by P.G.T. Beauregard, but now the Army of Northern Virginia had been pinned down at Petersburg. Grant knew that once Lee got wind that Union forces were on the move, he would send his best units to strengthen Petersburg lines. But as had happened several times before, Grant's generals hesitated to act, allowing Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard to build new interior defenses by June 16th. And even though Union forces were able to crack through Confederate lines by June 17th, darkness fell before they could make on real inroads. The two armies dug in, and Grant prepared for a long-term siege of the vital city. On July 27, 1864, Major General Hancock's two corps coordinated with General Philip Sheridan's cavalry, crossing north of the James River at Deep Bottom, July 27 through 29th, in an attempt to sever railroad lines in the Shenandoah Valley, linking General Lee and General Jubal Early, an attempt that fell quite short in managing to only penetrate the outer Confederate lines. On August 12, 1864, Hancock was promoted to brigadier general in the regular army, and from August 14th to 20th made another attempt to disrupt Lee's lines at Deep Bottom, only to fail again. Due to the heat and high numbers of new recruits, the battle was ultimately a Union defeat. With luck already seeming to be running against him, Hancock would now face the only significant military defeat of the Civil War. On August 25, 1864, while his two corps moved south of the city, tearing up track along the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, Confederate Major General Henry Heth launched a successful assault against the Union position at Reams Station in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, ultimately crushing Hancock's two corps and taking many of his men prisoner. This humiliating defeat not only tarnished an otherwise distinguished military career, it robbed him of any hope of securing an independent command and playing a prominent role in the remainder of the war. After suffering yet another beating at the Battle of Burgess Mill on October 27th and 28th, in November of 1864, Hancock made the decision to resign from field duty. Distraught from his mortifying defeat at Reams Station, increasingly concerned that Grant's war of attrition was resulting in unreasonable Union casualties, to which he was contributing, and still suffering pain from his Gettysburg wound, Hancock resigned his field commission to convalesce in Washington, D.C., where he served out the war very much as he'd begun it, leading a recruiting effort. The siege would carry on for nearly 10 months, and during the siege the famous battle took place when Union engineers burrowed underneath the Confederate siege lines and lit the fuse on a massive amount of ammunition, creating a crater in the field. But even then, the Battle of the Crater ended with a Union debacle, as Union forces swarmed into the crater instead of around it, giving the Confederates the ability to practically shoot fish in a barrel. Still, by the beginning of 1865, the Confederacy was in utter disarray. The main Confederate army in the West under John Bell Hood had been nearly destroyed by General Thomas's men at the Battle of Franklin in late 1864, and Sherman's army faced little resistance as it marched through the Carolinas. Although Confederate leaders remained optimistic, by the summer of 1864 they had begun to consider desperate measures in an effort to turn around the war. From 1863 to 1865, Confederate leaders had even debated whether to conscript black slaves and enlist them as soldiers. Even as their fortunes looked bleak, the Confederates refused to issue an official policy to enlist blacks. It was likely too late to save the Confederacy anyway. By the time Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address in March 1865, the end of the war was in sight. That month, Lincoln famously met with Grant, Sherman, and Admiral David Porter at City Point, Grant's headquarters during the siege, to discuss how to handle the end of the war. Lee's siege lines at Petersburg were finally broken on April 1st at the Battle of Five Forks, which is best remembered for General George Pickett, best remembered for Pickett's charge, enjoying a cod-bake lunch while his men were being defeated. Historians have attributed it to unusual environmental acoustics that prevented Pickett and his staff from hearing the battle despite their close proximity. Not that it mattered to the Confederates at the time. Between that and Gettysburg, Pickett and Lee were alleged to have held very poor opinions of each other by the end of the war, and there is still debate as to whether Lee had ordered Pickett out of the army during the Appomattox campaign. The following day, battles raged across the siege lines of Petersburg, eventually spelling doom for Lee's defenses. On April 2, 1865, Lee abandoned Petersburg, and thus Richmond with it. Chapter 16. The End of the War. Appomattox. Lee's battered army began stumbling toward a rail depot in the hopes of avoiding being surrounded by Union forces and picking up much-needed food rations. While Grant's army continued to chase Lee's retreating army westward, the Confederate government sought to escape across the Deep South. On April 4th, President Lincoln entered Richmond and toured the home of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Fittingly, the food rations did not arrive as anticipated. On April 7, 1865, Grant sent Lee the first official letter demanding Lee's surrender. In it, Grant wrote, "The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel it is so, and regret it as my duty to shift myself from the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." Passing the note to General Longstreet, now his only adviser, Longstreet said, "Not yet." But by the following evening, during what would be the final Confederate Council of War, and after one final attempt had been made to break through Union lines, Lee finally succumbed, stating regretfully, "There is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I had rather die 1,000 deaths." Communications continued until April 9th, at which point Lee and Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse. When Lee and Grant met, the styles and dress captured the personality differences perfectly. Lee was in full military attire, while Grant showed up casually in a muddy uniform. The Civil War's two most celebrated generals were meeting for the first time since the Mexican-American War. The Confederate soldiers had continued fighting while Lee worked out the terms of surrender, and they were understandably devastated to learn that they had surrendered. Some of his men had famously suggested to Lee that they continue to fight on. Porter Alexander would later rue the fact that he suggested to Lee that they engage in guerrilla warfare, which earned him a stern rebuke from Lee. As a choked-up Lee rode down the troop line on his famous horse Traveler that day, he addressed his defeated army, saying, "Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done my best for you. My heart is too full to say more." Appomattox is frequently cited as the end of the Civil War, but there still remained several Confederate armies across the country, mostly under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston, who Lee had replaced nearly 3 years earlier. On April 26th, Johnston surrendered all of his forces to General Sherman. Over the next month, the remaining Confederate forces would surrender or quit. The last skirmish between the two sides took place May 12th and 13th, ending ironically with a Confederate victory at the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas. 2 days earlier, Jefferson Davis had been captured in Georgia. Although the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Potomac at Appomattox Courthouse did not officially end the long and bloody Civil War, the surrender is often considered the final chapter of the war. For that reason, Appomattox has captured the popular imagination of Americans ever since Lee's surrender there on April 9, 1865. Hancock served in the Middle Military Division until the end of the war, never receiving an independent command, but effective March 13, 1865, was promoted to brevet major general in the regular army for his service at Spotsylvania. A year later, in 1866, the War Department recognized his contribution to the Civil War by making his wartime rank of major general in the regular army permanent. Hancock was almost certainly the greatest corps commander the Army of the Potomac had during the Civil War. And given how much more successful and competent he proved than others who actually led that army, it didn't escape many's notice that he was never given an independent command. In his famous memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant noted, "Hancock stands the most conspicuous figure of all the general officers who did not exercise a separate command. He commanded a corps longer than any other one, and his name was never mentioned as having committed in battle a blunder for which he was responsible. He was a man of very conspicuous personal appearance. His genial disposition made him friends, and his personal courage and his presence with his command in the thickest of the fight won for him the confidence of troops serving under him. No matter how hard the fight, the Second Corps always felt that their commander was looking after them." Chapter 17. Post-War Military Career. Reconstruction. At the close of the Civil War, General Hancock was assigned to supervise the execution of the people convicted in the conspiracy to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. Murdered on April 14, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, by May 9th of that year, a military commission had already been convened to try the accused. Though Booth himself was already dead, tracked to a farm in Virginia where he was killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett on April 26th, the trial of his co-conspirators had proceeded quickly, with President Andrew Johnson ordering the hangings of the convicted to be carried out on July 7th. Though reluctant to execute some of the less culpable conspirators, particularly Mary Surratt, Hancock carried out his orders, later writing that every soldier was bound to act as I did under similar circumstances. Surratt became the first woman executed by the United States federal government, and though he carried out orders, Hancock was criticized for opposing her execution. After the Lincoln hangings, Hancock was assigned command of the newly organized Middle Military Department, headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1866, on Grant's recommendation, Hancock was promoted to Major General and later that year transferred to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to assume command of the Military Department of Missouri, which included the states of Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Soon after arriving, General William Tecumseh Sherman assigned Hancock to lead an expedition to negotiate peace with the Cheyenne and Sioux, with whom relations had taken a turn for the worse after the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29, 1864. 700 Colorado Territory militia had attacked and destroyed a village of friendly Cheyenne and Arapaho, killing and mutilating an estimated 150 Native Americans, about two-thirds of whom were women and children. After a bad start, negotiations got even worse after Hancock ordered the burning of an abandoned Cheyenne village in central Kansas, after which an armed confrontation ensued. Though there was little actual loss of life on either side, Hancock failed to establish order, with relationships remaining strained. By January of 1867, it had become apparent around Washington, D.C. that President Andrew Johnson considered Reconstruction a mad, infamous revolution, and intended to oppose Congress at every turn. Radical Republicans responded by getting the House of Representatives to pass a resolution calling for an immediate impeachment investigation. In February, an official statement was issued regarding Johnson's attitude. If Johnson fails to execute the laws, in their spirit as well as in their letter, the president may, after all, come to be regarded as an obstacle which must be deposed. Unhappy with the way Republican generals were governing the South under Reconstruction, in mid-1867, President Johnson reassigned General Hancock to New Orleans, placing him in charge of the 5th Military District, which encompassed Texas and Louisiana. Almost immediately, Hancock ingratiated himself with the white conservative population by issuing his General Order No. 40 on November 29, 1867, expressing his support of Johnson's policies and declaring that so long as a state of peace exists in his district, he would not interfere with civil authorities. In essence, this meant no soldiers would be posted at polling places to protect black voters. To the South and Democrats of the North, this suggested that although Hancock had opposed the South's secession from the United States, he now supported leniency towards the defeated Confederates. Immediately condemned by radical Republicans in Washington and wholeheartedly approved by President Johnson, Hancock then proceeded to act on his declaration, denying local Republican politicians' requests to use his power to overturn elections and court verdicts in their favor, while also letting it be known that open insurrection would be militarily suppressed. This resulted in Hancock's popularity within the Democratic Party growing to such an extent that he was considered the presidential nominee frontrunner in the 1868 election. And although Hancock collected a significant number of delegates at the 1868 convention, his presidential aspirations went unfulfilled, with Ulysses S. Grant elected the 18th President of the United States. Heading west again. With Ulysses S. Grant's 1868 election to the White House, the Republicans gained a firm hold on Washington politics, and General Hancock transferred once again. This time, he was sent away from the sensitive Reconstruction issues to the isolated post that was the Department of Dakota, covering Minnesota, Montana, and the Dakotas. As with his previous Western command, Hancock began his duty with a conference of the regional Native American tribal leaders, but this time he was much more successful in establishing a state of peace. Less than 2 years later, however, in 1870, peace was broken when an army expedition massacred a Blackfoot settlement, and relations worsened as whites were granted government sanctioning to encroach into the Sioux's Black Hills in violation of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, guaranteeing the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills, including land and hunting rights in South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Still, Hancock managed to avert all-out war, and most of Hancock's time in Western Command was peaceful. During his Western tour of duty, General Hancock was afforded the unique opportunity to contribute to the creation of Yellowstone National Park. In August of 1870, Hancock ordered the 2nd Cavalry at Fort Ellis to provide a military escort for General Henry D. Washburn's exploration of the Yellowstone region, henceforth known as the Washburn-Langford-Doane Expedition. In 1871, during Captain John W. Barlow's subsequent exploration of the Yellowstone region, Barlow formally named a summit on what would become the southern boundary of the park, Mount Hancock, in honor of the general's contribution. Command in the East. In November of 1872, after General Meade died, General Hancock became the U.S. Army's senior major general, with Grant making him the new commander of the Division of the Atlantic, headquartered at Fort Columbus on Governor's Island, New York City. Although the new command covered a vast expanse of U.S. territory, the entire settled northeast area of the country, his command was militarily uneventful with the exception of the Army's involvement in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. At the time of his death on February 9, 1886, Hancock was still in command of the Military Division of the Atlantic. Chapter 18. Personal and Political Life, 1865 to 1888. Political Aspirations. On February 4, 1867, Hancock received word that his father had died. Then in 1875, 1879, and 1884, respectively, Hancock's daughter Ada, his mother Elizabeth, and his son Russell died. In 1867, Hancock published what is believed to be his only completed work, Reports of Major General W.S. Hancock upon Indian Affairs. Though seldom avert about his interest, while serving in his military capacity in New York City in command of Governor's Island, Hancock did his best to foster his political connections and apparent interest in the presidency. Subsequently, in the first ballot at the Democratic Convention of 1876, Hancock initially received considerable support, only to be swept from the field by New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden on the second ballot. When Republican Rutherford B. Hayes finally took the election, Hancock and his Democratic supporters set their sights on 1880. Considering the electoral crisis of 1876, the Tilden-Hayes presidential election was one of the most disputed in American history, and the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Democrats figured the political atmosphere surrounding the 1880 election would offer the best opportunity for a Democratic victory in a generation. Although Hancock had considerable Democratic support in the 1877 presidential election, he was unable to attract the majority of delegates needed. In 1880, however, Hancock's chances improved when President Hayes announced that he would not seek a second term, and Democratic favorite Samuel J. Tilden declined to run again due to failing health. Still, that year Hancock faced a lineup of renowned public figures, including Stephen Johnston Field, Thomas A. Hendricks, Thomas F. Bayard, and Allen G. Thurman, all vying for the presidential nomination. Ultimately, Democrats decided that Hancock's neutral position on the monetary gold standard issue, combined with his continued support of the South, stated in his General Order No. 40, meant that Hancock more than any other candidate had nationwide appeal. Thus, when the Democratic Convention assembled in Cincinnati in June 1880, Hancock led on the first ballot, but did not get the requisite two-thirds votes until the second. Ultimately, Winfield Scott Hancock became the 1880 Democratic presidential nominee, pitted against Republican James A. Garfield. Although Hancock's stance toward maintenance of the civil authorities in their natural and rightful dominion, as spelled out in his General Order No. 40, endeared Hancock to the majority of Democrats, Garfield's campaigners painted the Democrats as unsympathetic to the plight of industrial laborers, a group that would benefit by a high protective tariff. In the end, the tariff issue succeeded in cutting Democratic support in the industrialized northern states, which were essential to establishing a Democratic majority. Ultimately failing to carry any of the northern states except New Jersey, Hancock lost the election to James Garfield, who won just 39,213 more votes than Hancock. Final days. Following the election of 1880, Hancock left politics behind and continued in his capacity as commander of the Division of the Atlantic until his death in 1886. In 1881, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association, stating, "The object of the NRA is to increase the military strength of the country by making skill in the use of arms as prevalent as it was in the days of the Revolution." From 1878 until his death, Hancock was a charter director and the first president of the Military Service Institution of the United States, and from 1879 until his death, he was commander-in-chief of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States Veterans Organization. In 1885, Hancock made his last major public appearance, presiding over the funeral of Ulysses S. Grant. That same year, he made a much less publicized visit to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On February 9, 1886, Hancock died at Governor's Island. In 1887, Hancock's wife, Elmira, published Reminiscences of Winfield Scott Hancock. Chapter 19. Hancock's Legacy. Accolades. In his lifetime, General Winfield Scott Hancock received a commemorative service plate from the citizens of Pennsylvania for his years of service, a sword from the U.S. Sanitary Commission of St. Louis, Missouri, and an official thanks from the Congress of the United States. In Memoriam. On February 9, 1886, Winfield Scott Hancock died at Governor's Island, New York City, just 5 days short of his 62nd birthday, the victim of an infected carbuncle complicated by diabetes. He was buried in Montgomery Cemetery in West Norristown Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, near Norristown, Pennsylvania. Homage. General Winfield Scott Hancock is memorialized in a number of equestrian statues and portrait representations. An equestrian statue on East Cemetery Hill on the Gettysburg battlefield. A portrait statue, part of the Pennsylvania Memorial at Gettysburg. An alto rilievo, relief sculpture, depicting Hancock's wounding during Pickett's charge on the New York State Monument at Gettysburg. An equestrian statue located at Pennsylvania Avenue and 7th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. An equestrian statue atop the Smith Civil War Memorial in Fairmount Park, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A monumental bronze bust in Hancock Square, New York City, created by sculptor James Wilson Alexander MacDonald. Hancock's likeness also adorns U.S. currency on the $2 silver certificate series of 1886. Approximately 1,500 to 2,500 of these bills survive today, most in numismatic collections. Hancock's bill is ranked number 73 on a list of the 100 greatest American currency notes published by Bowers and Sonman. Hancock's legacy. Few men were as admired as Hancock the Superb from a civilian or military perspective. In 1880, President Hayes noted, "If, when we make up our estimate of a public man, conspicuous both as a soldier and in civil life, we are to think first and chiefly of his manhood, his integrity, his purity, his singleness of purpose, and his unselfish devotion to duty, we can truthfully say of Hancock that he was through and through pure gold." Although Winfield Scott Hancock's father, Benjamin, had hoped his son would choose a life path other than the military, it seems reasonable to assume that his future was in no small way led by the glorious name bestowed upon him at birth. Winfield Scott, the famed patriot and general of many American wars. And in that, Winfield showed so early, even as a boy, glimpses of martial discipline. Perhaps he had always foreseen himself in the military commander role. Even so, although his apparent skills and propensities put him at the center of the most pivotal battles in the Eastern Theater, including Gettysburg, he was never entrusted with a command of his own. Many historians ask if his greater potential had gone unnoticed, or that he had simply accomplished all that he was capable of accomplishing. Despite having disagreed with Grant's war of attrition and post-war treatment of the South, Grant had glowingly commended Hancock and pointed out that he was the most conspicuous of general officers who were not given an independent command. As one who made little overt effort to bring glory or attract recognition to his military career, perhaps Winfield Scott Hancock had assumed his efforts and accomplishments, as well as sacrifices, would speak for themselves, and he would be rewarded accordingly. There can be little doubt that after being dubbed Hancock the Superb so early in the game by Commanding Officer General McClellan, after his showing at the Battle of Williamsburg, Hancock assumed independent command was in his future, perhaps following the next battle. But when recognition still didn't arrive by November of 1863, Hancock began to question his resolve to remain part of the war effort. Even after displaying exemplary soldiering at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, and having been promoted to Major General for gallant, meritorious, and conspicuous share in that great and decisive victory, greater command still eluded him. He must have recognized that his efforts were often overshadowed by the flamboyant glory-seekers and political generals who owed their position to good connections. The McClellan effect. Some historians have speculated that Hancock was a victim of others' perceived failures, none more prominent than McClellan. After all, with the exception of Gettysburg, Hancock's superb performances and effective generalship in the Army of the Potomac still ended in tactical draws or Union defeats. From September 1861, when Hancock entered the war, until November 1862, Winfield Scott Hancock served under Major General George B. McClellan until President Lincoln removed McClellan from command for repeatedly showing reluctance to aggressively pursue Lee's army. Although McClellan was meticulous in his planning and preparations, he was always reluctant to move until he felt things were just right, which was difficult because he was chronically overestimating the strength of enemy units. Thus, even when he did engage in pitched battles, McClellan frequently kept large portions of his army in reserve rather than send them into an offensive action. Such was the case at the Battle of Williamsburg, as well as the Battle of Antietam. While the Battle of Williamsburg, fought on May 5, 1862, was deemed militarily inconclusive, with some historians giving a slight edge to the Union, the only reason it did not end in a clear-cut Union victory was because McClellan refused to follow up on Hancock the Superb's brilliant showing and allowed the Confederate forces to retreat unscathed rather than pursue and deliver as much damage as his army was capable. Similarly, at the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, despite greatly outnumbering Lee's army, McClellan was unwilling to send in his reserves to exploit breaks in the Confederate line. In the end, he simply allowed Lee to execute a tactical evacuation, avoiding potential annihilation, instead of pursuing and taking advantage of his clear military advantage. And even with General Hancock assuming command of the 1st Division, 2nd Corps, clearly prepared for battle, General McClellan ordered Hancock and his men to maintain their position rather than take the offensive. Lincoln and the North deemed McClellan's Peninsula and Maryland campaigns a failure and a missed opportunity, respectively. Though Lincoln fired McClellan in November 1862, some historians have suggested McClellan was not removed from command soon enough to prevent irreparable damage to Hancock's career. On the Peninsula and at Antietam, Hancock's success was either not exploited or Hancock was not given opportunities to prove himself further. On top of that, as a longtime general officer in the Army of the Potomac, he was naturally associated with its costly defeats. Hancock will always be remembered for his amazing performance at Gettysburg. But did the McClellan effect ultimately taint Hancock's chances for solo command? That is something about which historians can only speculate. But had he not been associated with a series of missed opportunities, he may have been provided the opportunity to live up to his Hancock the Superb cognomen and gone down in history as one of the Civil War's primary players, rather than just a superb, supportive one. This has been Hancock the Superb, the life and career of General Winfield Scott Hancock. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Scott Clem. Copyright 2013 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2017 by Charles River Editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.